Here we go. 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're live. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Let everybody know who you are. Layne.
I'm a meathead who likes science. Got into bodybuilding when I was young, and then did a BS in biochemistry, Ph.D. in nutritional science. Kept lifting, did powerlifting, won 2 national championships, got silver medal at Worlds, set a then world squat record, and did also bodybuilding and won a natural pro card. They actually have natural bodybuilding, believe it or not. And throughout that time, just, when I first got into it, one magazine said one thing, and even in the same magazine, they'd have an article one month, next month it would contradict it. So I was like, I'm just going to try and figure this shit out for myself.
Which is the place that a lot of people listening are at right now.
Yeah, and it's tough because it's kind of like, who do you trust? Because not everybody has the time or the energy to go and do a degree in this stuff. So, but that was me. I kind of got down the rabbit hole of, all right, let's try and figure this nutrition stuff out. And of course, the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know. But it just became a passion for me and to this day, I'm still I love this stuff. This is what gets me up, gets me going.
Well, guys like you are very important. Guys who actually train very hard and really understand the science. This is because it's usually one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when I was doing it, I graduated my PhD in 2010. When we started, we actually both knew each other from the bodybuilding.com message boards. So this was back before social media.
Trained together back in 2006 or 7?
At Experimental Biology. So there's a big symposium every year for science geeks. And we were both going to it. And we found out about each other on the forums. And we went and trained together. And he's a beast. We really hit it off, and we've been friends since then. So for everybody who's looking for a fight, sorry, we're probably going to be pretty friendly.
Well, it's going to be a conversation. We don't need to have a fight. And Dom, you've been on the podcast before, but for people who didn't listen to that one, please tell them who you are and what you do.
I'm...
Keep the sucker.
Sure. Getting back, I majored in nutrition actually as an undergrad, but didn't actually see a career in it that much. So I went into neuroscience. The 90s was a decade of the brain. And my formal training is in neuroscience, and it got steered towards basically changing the neuropharmacology of the brain with nutrition, and that's what the ketogenic diet does. And it has tremendous benefits, I think, for military personnel, which is funded by the Office of Navy Research and the Department of Defense, to develop ketogenic strategies to enhance readiness, resilience, and performance and safety in military personnel.
And why specifically does the ketogenic diet help military people? I know there's a thing with Navy SEALs with preventing epilepsy.
So central nervous system oxygen toxicity, a limitation of that is, or a limitation of Navy SEAL diving is oxygen toxicity seizures. And anti-epileptic drugs are not really a viable option because they can, their side effects, they can decrease cognitive resilience, physical resilience. A ketogenic strategy is something that's being studied now from a basic science mechanistic perspective to animal work to now human studies. So it's not, out in the field yet, but some guys are actually doing it. And I study the science of that. And
so for people who don't understand what we're saying, for some folks who have epilepsy, the ketogenic diet has been shown to stop seizures.
Absolutely. Go Google the Charlie Foundation. So that's how I actually got linked in. And actually I met a natural drug-free bodybuilder. His name was Mike Dancer, and he had severe terminal epilepsy. Google Mike Dancer ketogenic diet, and you'll find an amazing story about a guy who used nutrition to manage his epilepsy when drugs failed, and he used it to prep and win bodybuilding shows and compete in bodybuilding.
And the rebreathers sometimes cause seizures with some of the soldiers.
They can. So, for example, just 50 feet of seawater using a closed-circuit rebreather, like a Draeger rebreather, at 50 feet of seawater, your potential for getting oxygen toxicity seizure can occur in just 10 minutes. So that's a little bit of time, and that's not very deep. So there's no way to predict that, and there's no way as of now to prevent that. So we study physiological biomarkers that could warn people of an impending seizure, and we also develop countermeasures to mitigate oxygen toxicity seizures. I focus mostly on drugs. I'm in a pharmacology and physiology department. But I realized that people with epilepsy, the ketogenic diet was more effective than drugs. So I got steered into, nutrition, which was my undergrad, and then that kicked off about 10 years ago, and I've just been deep into probably a dozen or more different applications of nutritional ketosis.
Awesome. And Layne, I've been paying attention to you online for a long time. One of the things you do a great job with is just calling bullshit on, you love to call bullshit, clearly. But whenever people are overstating claims or people get ridiculous, and I think this is one of the things that is a problem with any diet where people get really enthusiastic about it. That becomes an ideology, whether it's the ketogenic diet or the carnivore diet or the, fill in the blanks, vegan diet. People decide this is the end all be all. It's going to cure cancer, make you smarter, the dick's going to grow a foot. All these things are going to happen. And you do a great job of calling bullshit on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm not anti-keto. I'm not anti-vegan. I'm anti-bullshit. And one of the problems we have is nutrition is replacing religion for a lot of people. So you find something that you identify with, and then people start to try to say, because they identify with that movement, or like, for example, vegans, they identify with, many of them, protection of animals. Not my job to judge their ethics on that sort of thing. But then they kind of try to backtrack to find the science to support them as well. And they pick and choose, and this is guilty of all groups, not just vegans. This is also a lot of ketogenic diet zealots, carnivore diet, whatever have you. If it has the word diet, there's zealots out there who are going after it. And I will stick up for, I've stuck up at a scientific conference for the ketogenic diet. We were having a roundtable about something different. And somebody said, well, we know that the ketogenic diet impairs exercise performance in endurance athletes. And I said, I don't think that's necessarily true. It's pretty ambivalent or ambiguous as to whether or not it does. It seems to be kind of individual. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, on the average, it doesn't seem to impair exercise performance. So it's kind of what you like. But when you have people who, like a Gary Taubes who says, well, calories don't matter. It's all carbohydrates. That sort of thing, or the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. The research is, you're able to do a lot of hand waving about insulin and, will you burn so much fat when you're on a high fat diet, which is true, by the way, you burn a lot of fat, but what they don't talk about is that it's overall fat balance, how much fat you store versus how much fat you burn. And when you're on a high fat diet, you store a lot of fat. You also burn a lot of fat. The overall caloric balance is what determines whether or not you will have net storage or net deposition. And the same thing for high carb diet as well. This idea that with high insulin, it just completely shuts down all fat burning everywhere. That's just not true. Now, if you have high carbohydrate, you will burn less fat, but you're also storing less fat as well. And again, the net caloric balance is going to be what determines how much you store, because you don't really store carbohydrate as fat for most people. They did a study overfeeding women where they overfed them 50% above their caloric maintenance. And they found that of 282 grams of fat that they stored during a day in adipose, only 4 grams came from carbohydrate. 278 came from fat.
So glucose, what about fructose? So fructose causes, we think, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So that could be, that's de novo lipogenesis is higher with fructose. And you're think about people consuming it in liquid drinks, 100 to 200 grams a day, which is not uncommon, even for my wife, not uncommon.
So fructose does seem to have a little bit of different hepatic metabolism. But I was actually across the hall from a professor who was doing a lot of the research on fructose and obesity and fatty liver disease. And even he came to the conclusion that if you overfeed fructose and it creates a caloric surplus, and you're overfeeding fructose, then you can have some wonky stuff start to go on.
Relative to other macros.
Right.
Try to keep this right next to your face. Sorry.
Got it.
That's what she said.
Layne is so powerful.
I talk loud and a lot.
It's good.
So if you're doing that, if you're creating that caloric surplus, what you find is when you're in net storage, when you're driving more nutrients into adipose and sometimes liver, depending on metabolism, but it takes a lot of fructose to do that and a caloric surplus. You start to create a lot of wonky stuff going on. The mitochondria starts to become dysfunctional, and people make a big deal about, we have claimed now that everything causes obesity and type 2 diabetes. For first, it was fats, then carbohydrates. And there's actually professors out there who actually will claim that protein gives you diabetes.
Can I stop you for a second? What do you mean the mitochondria becomes dysfunctional? How does the mitochondrial, how does that happen?
Okay, so I'm going to state for everybody that I'm going out on a limb. This is my opinion.
Okay.
If you look at the research on obesity and diabetes, what happens is you have everything start to elevate in the bloodstream. So if you measure, like, there was a professor who thought that branched chain amino acids were causing obesity because they were elevated in the bloodstream during type 2 diabetes. Well, yeah, branched chain amino acids are elevated. So is fatty acids, so are triacylglycerides, so is glucose. So is it really those things causing it, or is it possible that when you are overfeeding relative to what you burn, relative to that turnover, that mitochondria start to become dysfunctional, probably a lot due to inactivity. And the mitochondria is, as we call it, the powerhouse of the cell, as you probably learned in high school biology or whatever they taught it to you as. That is where everything fluxes through. So that is where you're creating ATP. That's where you're burning through lipids, carbohydrates, that sort of thing. If that becomes dysfunctional and you're not getting enough flux, enough pull through that mitochondria, what happens is you start to back up every part of metabolism. So all the metabolic byproducts, almost all of them, inhibit everything within the cell.
There's a metabolomic signature for that, and an epiphenomenon, if you want to call it that, would be elevated branched chain amino acids. Could be a consequence of that in some people. Yeah.
So these things start, these byproducts, these metabolic byproducts, because you're not fluxing enough through the cell, they start accumulating within the cell and start to inhibit the Krebs cycle, glycolysis. And so everything starts backing up to the point where you also start inhibiting the insulin receptor. And now you have glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids also backing up to the point where they start to overspill into the bloodstream. And you see this accumulation of all of them in the bloodstream in type 2 diabetes. And I actually think that, again, me going out on a limb, that obesity doesn't cause type 2 diabetes and type 2 diabetes doesn't cause obesity, that they develop in concert from the same problem, which is overfeeding underactivity. So a lot of it is about how much nutrients you're fluxing into cells versus how much energy you're creating, fluxing them through the cell and out. So when you're overfeeding, whether it be carbohydrate, fat, you're fluxing more energy in than you can dispose of, and now you have to do something with it. Well, when you do that much to it and mitochondria start to become dysfunctional, you start to not have enough places to put it away, and it starts spilling into the bloodstream, and now you cause all kinds of problems.
So one of the things that we really wanted to talk about here is high carb versus low carb, because this is just a giant point of contention today in nutrition, especially in terms of athletes with performance in mind. It's a big factor, whether or not high carb or low carb is the way to go. And there's a lot of zealots on both sides, and there's a lot of bullshit, and there's a lot of online experts. And one of the great thing about bringing you two guys in here is because you could really actually explain the science behind it. Now, you've been great, Layne, at pointing out that it's not a magic bullet. And so many people like to sort of stress it that way, that they like to portray ketogenic diet as this is it, this is the end all be all, I figured out what to do, this is the way everyone should be eating. You don't think so?
I don't think so, because if you look at the weight loss problem in our society, and I'm writing a book called Fat Loss Forever where I talk about this in detail, we don't have a weight loss problem. 6 out of every 7 people are able to lose a significant amount of body weight in their life who are obese or overweight. The problem is the weight regain statistics are absolutely terrifying. Within 1 year, 70% will put it all back on. Within 2 years, it's 85%. Within 3 years, it's 95%. So that means diets have a 95% failure rate. And of those people, 1/3 to 2/3 will add more than they originally lost. And this gets kind of into yo-yo dieting, and I talk about that as well. But the real problem is that people don't pick something that's sustainable for them. All the research, if there's one bit of research out there that we have that shows how to create lasting weight loss, and you look at the people who are the 5% who actually keep it off, it's that they pick something that's sustainable. whether it be ketogenic, whether it be low carb, high or low fat, whatever it is, vegan, something that they can sustain and make a lifestyle. Because if you look at meta-analyses, for our listeners, meta-analyses are kind of a study of studies. So researchers take studies that have similar parameters and they kind of lump them together. And they look at, okay, what's the consensus amongst these studies? And they have advanced statistics they use to run this. If you look at low carb versus low fat, there's no difference in adherence overall on the whole. There's no difference. And there's no difference in weight loss. There's no difference in blood lipids, even glycemic control. So there was a study where a meta-analysis of, I think it was 23 studies over 3,000 people, where they looked at, okay, if you control calories, so calories are equated, does low carb versus low fat make a difference on weight loss, glycemic control, those sorts of things?
Not necessarily the ketogenic diet. So by definition, we have an objective biomarker that defines the ketogenic diet. It's the only diet that actually has something that you can measure in your blood to say you're on this diet. And when your ketone levels are elevated, that confers many different benefits that I believe can enhance adherence to the diet.
Before we get into the woods here, I want to clarify one thing.
Yep.
The difference between someone being on a diet and being able to sustain it and not being able to sustain it and gaining all that weight back, isn't that a discipline issue?
Well, partly, but we kind of have to start looking at, okay, if we go in, let me recircle. We have to find what requires the least amount of discipline for somebody to stick to, because discipline is while some people have more, some people have less, it is a finite resource. So when do we normally find that people like kind of drop off whatever they're doing? It's when they're stressed out, work's stressing them out, they're going through a divorce, those kinds of things, right? That's where our discipline kind of wanes, because we're trying to be so disciplined for this other thing, and it's draining us. So what happens with diet is, in people who are busy, people who have a lot of stress in their life, that's where they really start overeating. So we have to find something that I look at it as, let's find something that requires the minimal amount of discipline for a person, so that when your life goes to absolute shit, you can still stick to it. And so for some people, that is a very, very individual thing. And they see this in the dietary studies, that what works for one person to create a deficit and sustainable isn't the same way for another person. And Dom even commented on this about his wife, Chilla. She does much better on a higher ratio of carbohydrates to fat.
Yeah, I mean, early on, it was obvious that she wasn't going to change her diet. The time that we met, like 10 years ago almost, I was really getting into this, and I really felt that, for me at least, but she would stop at Checkers and get a burger and with a sugary drink, and she's tremendously carb intolerant. She was very skinny as a kid, and she tolerates carbohydrate. She's very carbohydrate tolerant.
Yes.
Did I say intolerant? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and if the diet low carb, I feel, and maybe in ketogenic, putting it under that umbrella, works, I think, for up to 25 to 30% of people, especially if they're carbohydrate intolerant. And I believe that it does that by virtue of elevating ketones, shifting the neuropharmacology of the brain. For example, it works through ghrelin. There's new science emerging right now showing that appetite regulation is influenced positively by nutritional ketosis in ways that we're just starting to learn now.
Well, you can certainly feel it. It's one of the weirder things about the ketogenic diet. When you're in that state, all of a sudden you're just not hungry the same. There's not an overwhelming need for food.
Yeah, I haven't had anything to eat today. I mean, when I was eating massive plates of pasta 25 years ago, and I went to this long without food, I would start getting shaky. I would have a hypoglycemic response, and I'm completely resilient to that. And that has major implications for military personnel being keto adapted, not just for performance, preventing seizures, and I think for cognitive function too. But it's very liberating. So meal frequency is not an issue. So if you're in austere environments where you have limited food availability, that becomes a major issue. And if you're working as a scientist and you can't, you're working with animals, you're doing experiments, you don't have time to eat, I need to maintain that cognitive function. I need to be sharp, with limited food. So it worked very good for me throughout my professorship, getting tenure and things like that, where I could just put more time and energy into my work without having to stop, prepare a meal, eat a meal, clean up. Like, I think I wasted a lot of time doing that when I was eating 5 to 6 meals a day.
He said something that I think you've called bullshit on before. The phrase carb intolerant.
So that was actually going to be one of the things I was going to say. Hey, we have something we can disagree about because
carb tolerance, you would say
depends on how we define that.
Yes.
So if
I define it by a blood marker, your glucose response to a meal.
Okay, so a couple of things. I want to come right out and frame this whole discussion real quick. So we both agree that in terms of weight loss and body composition, that your total calorie intake per day is the most important thing. Correct?
Yes, and I believe the ketogenic strategy is a way to regulate that.
Right. So with carb intolerance, if you look at the benefits of like on blood glucose, blood lipids, it is almost 90 to 95% explained by weight loss. So you can take people, put them on a high carb, very low fat diet, their blood glucose and their blood lipids will drop, even with like higher insulin levels than people who are on a low carb diet.
If they're on a calorie restricted diet.
Yes, if they're calorie restricted. Now again, that becomes a very individual thing. If somebody says, hey, I like a ketogenic diet because for me it helps me to create a calorie deficit, I can stick to it. Hey, knock yourself out. That is no problem. But that is not always going to work. Some people don't feel that satiated on a ketogenic diet. There are people who do feel hungrier on that. So that is a very individual response. And again, when we look at studies, we're looking at means, right? So we're talking about averages. And there are outliers. Like if you look at any Gaussian distribution chart, which is kind of how populations distribute based on a certain treatment, you have about 60 to 70% that fall into the average. Then you have another, 10, 20% that are kind of do a little bit better one way versus the other. And then you have 5% on either end 2.5% on either end that are outliers, right? So just to frame this again, let's take weightlifting. We know weightlifting makes you bigger and stronger, right? Like that is not up for debate. We agree on that. There are studies that have shown that some people who are beginners, where you should be gaining a lot of muscle very quickly, some people will go from the first time they walk in the gym, squat 185, 12 weeks later, they're squatting 400 pounds. Some people don't get stronger. There have actually been studies where over 12 weeks, there's a few individuals who did not get stronger. So those are your outliers right there. So if we circle this back to ketogenic diet, I'm not sitting here and saying that somebody may actually physiologically do better on a ketogenic diet versus a lower fat diet. That's a very individual response. But when we start making recommendations for people, what we should start with is, okay, create a calorie deficit that allows you to lose some weight. Because if we look at the studies and if we equate for protein, because that's a big thing. So if you look at some of the studies where Volek did, where he compared like your kind of food guide pyramid type diet to a ketogenic diet, the ketogenic diets were a little bit higher protein. That protein has a thermogenic effect and also an appetite suppression effect. When you equate for those, and there's been 32 studies, there was a recent meta-analysis done of 32 studies that equated for calories and protein. Absolutely no difference in fat loss when you equate for those two, calories and protein, because protein's a big one, because protein has a big benefit on thermogenesis and weight loss. Also lean body mass retention, which is huge, because one of the reasons people regain weight is because when they lose weight, they tend to lose fat and muscle, and when they regain it, it's almost all fat in the initial phase. As far as
that data may not have included data with the ketogenic diet. So I know, when I did the diet, I've seen a lot of blood work. So for example, my hemoglobin H1C, triglycerides, HSCRP goes down, insulin goes down, blood pressure goes down, and that all those changes happened without my body weight changing. So that would kind of argue against that you needed a calorie deficit. And I've seen it many times. But once I could be eating 80 to 90% carbs and reduce my body weight and get changes in all that. I could actually increase my carbs. And if I create a calorie deficit, my hemoglobin H1C will go down, my sugar will go down, things like that. So that is really the drive. That's like, that trumps everything, that calorie deficit. So that's an important thing.
So that's what I think a lot of people miss. Okay. And I think that that what I'll say is, sorry,
I'm just saying, so like, I think that's very powerful too, that these changes that I just mentioned can occur without changing your body weight. So they are just, you're fundamentally changing your metabolism when you do that from and that has pretty wide-ranging implications.
So I think that what I'm going to say is that if we're going to talk about people getting healthier, the first thing we need to start with is let's not lose 50%, arguing about 5%, right? So if I tell somebody, hey, find a diet you can stick to that's sustainable, and if you can lose 10%, you can lose 10% of your body weight, even for obese people, they get almost all the health benefits in the first 10%. Now maybe some people like you or people who respond really well to a ketogenic diet, there's outliers or people on the other sides of the Gaussian curve. If you do a little bit better on there, then great. But if you find a ketogenic diet is completely unsustainable for you and you're not able to stick to it, but you're trying to do it because you're trying to get a little bit better blood glucose regulation, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because if you could stick to, like, let's say for the individual, a higher carb diet was easier for them to stick to, they could lose weight on that. Then that's the bulk of their health benefits they're going to get from it.
I'm having a hard time with these terms, easier, because I don't know exactly why it would be easier or wouldn't be easier. And I always wonder, again, is this a discipline issue?
Because that's your experience.
Food preference. It comes
food
down
preference
to
for sure.
Food preference, but I believe that when you follow low carb, not even ketogenic diet, the variability of the fluctuations in your insulin and blood glucose, the postprandial dip in blood glucose that you get after you eat, that's virtually abolished or significantly attenuated. And then you have, ketones and are working through ghrelin, for example. You could eat a normal diet and drink ketones, and it's actually suppressing your appetite through ghrelin. So we know that these changes
through reductions in ghrelin, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So these changes sort of are happening, but my sister, for example, followed the ketogenic diet and found it easy to follow, but she gained weight because she was eating all these fat bombs that she was making. So she
went too far.
And a lot of people don't necessarily need a nutritionist to tell them what to do, but they need like a nutritional psychotherapist or something. Their relationship with food is really, and I think that's what Layne has a firm grasp on. There's no substitute for experience. And Layne has worked with so many different clients and knows that, you could probably follow the ketogenic diet. Your listeners are probably fans of the ketogenic diet. I can do it. I love fatty food, high fat food, low carb food. But generally speaking, it's, you have to approach it from the perspective of sort of eating behavior. And I think that's really, people want to go off the diet. It's just a natural human trait.
Yeah, it's a weird psychological trait, right?
Yeah.
You just want to cheat. You want to just stuff your face with cupcakes every now and then. And then you feel like it's too much torture to keep yourself on this narrow path of high fat, low carb, moderate protein.
But, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was the case. But now there's ketogenic brownies, there's ketogenic cookies, there's many different food companies.
They all taste like shit.
Check it. Well, go
really
to.
do. I've tried so hard.
Go to keto.
You have a real one and a keto cookie, and that fucking real cookie gets eaten every time.
Yeah. Well, they are evolving. Just food technology is evolving.
I'm kidding. Some of them, Foods make some good stuff.
Go to ketonutrition.org, and there's some things there that are. I would say about 10 or 20% pass the test, meaning that they taste okay and they actually do what they say. They actually elevate ketones or, don't cause a glycemic response.
Some of those keto cookies seem like they have no foundation. Like you bite in, they go away like as you're eating them. It's like they dissolve, They're not like you have like a good Toll House cookie, a good real chocolate chip cookie, and you bite into that sucker. It's bad for you, but god damn, it feels good while it's being bad.
Did you try the Quest protein cookies?
Yes, they're pretty good.
Yeah,
they're pretty good. Some of them are pretty good.
Yeah.
They can't fuck with real cookies.
No.
Yeah. Well, I dip them in like sour cream, right? And then I eat them or coconut cream. So then it becomes ketogenic.
Sour cream, Jesus Christ, man!
Don't knock it till you
So
try it.
it's a commitment to high fat.
You bring that up. Interesting though. If you look at people that think they're addicted to sugar or that sugar is a lot, if you look at things like cookies and cakes and all, it's actually they have more calories from fats than they do sugars. It's sugar and fat together is hyper palatable, right? So one of the things I was going to bring up is, this idea that sugar is so inherently bad. And you said the cookie, we view that as an inherently bad thing. But what if I told you that there were certain people, not everybody's different, but there were certain people who, if you tell them, hey, you can have that cookie every once in a while, if you track it, work it into your macronutrient intake, that's fine, that actually improved their adherence to diet. So
because you give them a reward?
No, not a reward system. You're not a dog. Don't reward yourself with food.
Okay.
because increased flexibility actually usually improves adherence. So we see this actually with training too. Athletes, when you do a flexible training model, where they have to get in a certain amount of training, but they kind of can pick and choose themselves which days are hard and which days are a little bit, they actually do better. Diet is very similar to that. So now you always have to sacrifice something in order to, if you want to lose weight, right? So if you're doing a ketogenic diet, what you're sacrificing is saying, well, I like the spontaneous reductions in appetite, so I don't mind eating not these foods so I can get that. If you're doing like kind of what, I don't want to say I popularized it, but myself and some other people on the message boards popularized something called flexible dieting, where you can eat essentially whatever you want as long as you hit your protein, carbohydrate, and fat targets. Now what you're sacrificing is, okay, you're tracking every day.
Do you do that through an app?
Through what?
An app?
No, I'm old school. I actually just do it through Excel. Okay. My girlfriend Holly, she has an app on her phone, and like she has me like, if she's driving, she's like, oh, will you put in what I just ate? I'm like, babe, I have no idea how to work this thing, So, because when I went to do my graduate studies, I wanted to find magic foods. I wanted to find something that would, because how else can you make a living? You have to set yourself apart. If I'm over here saying, it's hard for me to sell what I do. Because I'm saying, well, everything in moderation, and you got to be diligent, and you got to have these behaviors, and that doesn't sound sexy when there's another guy over here saying, nah, bro, it's just carbs. I know metabolism's complicated and everything, but it's just carbs. When I started working with people, and I've worked with over 1,500 people coaching in nutrition online over the past 13 years, which actually probably taught me more than my Ph.D. did. What I found is that people were so different individually in terms of what made them tick. Now I feel like I should probably go back and get some kind of...
Makes them tick biologically, what makes them tick, or psychologically?
Both.
Yeah.
So I can't sit here and say by the research that carbohydrate versus fat makes a difference on fat loss. But what I can tell you is that some people just seem to do better on lower carb, higher fat, but also some people I worked with just seem to do better with higher carb, lower fat. Now, whether that's a psychological thing or a physiological thing, it's hard to tease out.
Genetically too, I think. We all have different SNPs, some people have suppressed fatty acid oxidation pathways, others are like screaming fat metabolizers, or fat or sugar metabolizers.
Yeah. So, but if you look at, I remember I had a conversation with the researcher, Dr. Nakamura at Illinois, who was doing some of that fructose stuff when I was a first year grad student. I said, well, it's this high fructose corn syrup. This is what's causing obesity, right? And he's like, well, it's easy to overconsume. Like if you take a soda and you drink it, you're not less hungry than you were. It's not very satiating. He said, but if you're controlling your calories, it doesn't seem to be more lipogenic than comparable carbohydrate. And I remember thinking, well, that can't be right. All these people say that high fructose corn syrup is like the worst thing in the world for you. There was a few studies that really changed my opinion on sugar. Now, the listeners are going to hear this and think that I'm advocating for sugar. I'm not.
You're not talking about in the context of a calorie surplus.
Mm-hmm.
A surplus amount of fructose which is kind of explains the state of the United States,
Partly. So if you look at sugar intake, this kind of gets back to the carbohydrate insulin obesity model. If you look at sugar intake over the last 50 years or last 100 years, it went up very steadily with obesity until around the mid-90s, and then it took a sharp dip while obesity continued to climb. Now again, that's just correlation data. But if you do look at the overall calorie intake versus obesity rates, it's like an R squared of like 0.94, which is really close.
Does sugar include high fructose corn syrup? Is that lumped into sugar?
So this was added sugars. Okay. But there was a study done by a metabolic ward study. So
Can I stop you there?
Yep.
Are you saying that this is added sugars, not high fructose corn syrup? So when you talk about the graph of consumption, that sugar dropped off, but high fructose corn syrup did not? Is that accurate?
Because that took over
Right.
in many of the products.
So if
So
there's
here's-
an increase in obesity, but a decrease in sugar consumption, but you're not saying a decrease in high fructose corn syrup consumption.
So I don't know that. I'd have to look that up. So here's me being a scientist and saying the three magic words I don't know.
Thank
One of
you.
the last
Appreciate
conferences I went to showed that, like the rise over the last 10 to 15 years, like skyrocketing with high fructose corn syrup. And because sugar was taken out, high fructose corn syrup is subsidized by farmers, a lot cheaper and more.
Would you agree that it's essentially your body, the way it processes it is essentially the same? Sugar versus high fructose corn syrup, calorie for calorie?
Well, so sugar, sucrose, is 50% glucose, 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose, 45% glucose. But if you're saying that 5% is what's creating obesity, now, again, psychologically, some people just down sodas like it's their job, you know.
Right.
And if you're doing that, especially as children, that's a big, big no-no.
Whether it's the Mexican kind with the cane sugar,
We
or
have
whether it's-
kids now with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that did not exist.
But I would say
20
that-
years ago, we got little kids. With
And you think that's from corn syrup?
I think it's due to an excess surplus calories, and those surplus calories being high fructose corn syrup.
So if you're used to eating a certain amount of calories, and we back when we were actually maintaining our weight back in before the 60s, we were eating about 2,200 calories a day. That was the average, and now it's like 2,800 is the average consumption in the United States amongst adults.
I think I eat a lot more than that.
But you train, and you have a higher lean body mass, so that's fine. Now some people, that's a whole other rabbit hole.
Yeah.
If you start adding sodas in, which aren't satiating at all, they don't positively affect your hunger hormones, but you continue your same normal food intake, boom. I mean, you can start to store, right?
Yeah.
So, but I can't tell somebody, hey, there's no way you can lose weight and drink a soda, because that's not true. There was a study done by Surwitt, and they looked at high glycemic diet versus low glycemic, and I mean extreme. They did, one group had over 100 grams of sugar a day. Another group had 10 grams or less per day. Or sorry, it was 11 grams or less per day. And they looked at the differences in weight loss, blood lipids, all that kind of stuff.
Did they
calories-
adjust for carbohydrates? So the group that ate 10 grams of sugar or less a day, did they eat the same amount of total carbohydrates?
Same amount of total carbs.
Okay.
So
same amount of
low
total
glycemic
carbs.
versus
Okay.
high glycemic.
Yeah,
right?
and processed carbs can spike your glucose more than sugar.
Right. So they did have a higher fiber intake, but what they did find that they had higher insulin responses to the meal. The high sugar group did, but no differences in weight loss. So they both groups lost weight. The only real difference was the lower glycemic group had a little bit better. Both groups improved cholesterol. The lower glycemic group had just a little bit better improvement, probably because they were eating higher fiber, which can bind cholesterol and you excrete it. I would like to see what happened if they equated. So again, it's creating that calorie deficit. Both groups lost weight. Now, is it more difficult to create a calorie deficit if you're eating a lot of sugar? Yes. Okay. So I always tell people your diet is like a budget if you're practicing something like flexible dieting, right? So if I've got somebody like myself who has above average muscle mass, hopefully I can say that, and people on the internet are probably going to knock me.
You fucking dick.
Look at him, he's wearing a shirt with his name on it. So
Okay, I'll say it. You have above average muscle mass.
thank you.
You're welcome.
So if you have above average muscle mass, you train hard, you have a faster metabolism naturally. I mean, I've seen people who could maintain their body weight on 6,000, 7,000 calories a day. You have a higher metabolic rate. You have a really big budget. So if you make $100 million a year, is it a big deal for you to go out and buy a $500,000 sports car if you can still pay your mortgage and pay all the other requirements that you have? No, it's fine. But if you make 80 grand a year, should you go out and buy a $500,000 sports car? Probably not, right?
And
it's
if you
the same-
make 30, you should be on the keto diet. Yeah.
so you'd have increased food efficiency. So it's the same thing. So like people, so pop-tarts somehow became the model of the flexible dieting movement because people were,
What?
here's why. it's kind of like counterculture.
It's like a pop-tart zealots out there.
It's like, so whenever you have, so clean eating became a thing amongst bodybuildings. We say you eat clean, even though there's no
Broccoli
objective.
and chicken, baby.
There's no objective definition of
Right.
that. So people were like, oh yeah, well, I'm getting shredded and I eat a Pop-Tart every day, right? So
A lot of your followers do that.
they do.
Yeah.
Now, but I don't,
Layne
I
kinda
actually don't even,
created that.
I don't even like Pop-Tarts, to
Did
be
you
honest.
do this? Did you start this?
No.
Yes.
It's more
I
about,
don't know who else, you know.
hang on, let me put some context to this. So it's more about people saying, hey, I can still eat these foods I enjoy and I'm still losing weight because I'm in a calorie deficit and I'm hitting my protein, carb, and fat targets. But if you're somebody with a slow metabolism and you're not exercising very much and maybe all you're eating is 100 grams of carbs a day, should you spend 75 grams of those carbs on 2 Pop-Tarts? Hell no. That's a terrible idea because you're not going to be able to hit your other micronutrients and those sorts of things. But if you're eating 4,000 calories, like an Alberto Nunez, a friend of ours,
Yeah,
if you're eating 4,000 calories a day and losing weight, is it a big deal if he has 2 Pop-Tarts? Not really, because I actually had one competitor, a competitor, who had such a fast metabolism that he was actually having a lot of GI dysfunction because he was eating like 700 grams of carbs and 200 grams of fat per day just to maintain his weight. And he said, I feel bloated all the time. And I said, well, what are you eating? Like, what are your foods? And it was chicken, rice, and broccoli. And I said, and some peanut butter for fats. And I'm like, well, no wonder, dude. You're having 150 grams of fiber a day. You're literally full of shit. Like, your shit is like literally backed up to your esophagus, okay? So I said, do me a favor. Eat some pizza, eat some Pop-Tarts, eat some more calorically dense foods, and see how you feel after 3 days. He emailed me after 3 days. He was like, man, I feel so much better. I dropped like 3 pounds. I feel amazing.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well,
because he
Layne
got rid of-
inspired the Pop-Tart generation. He also inspired, and I watched this play out online.
This makes me sound really bad.
Well, Layne actually inspired a generation of drug-free bodybuilders to go and do their PhDs. You know, and actually, one's in my lab right now. Is an amazing student, Andrew Kutnick.
I coached him for a little while.
Yeah, amazing student, and I think he learned a lot just from watching Layne. So, but I think, you know, that it was amazing to see these guys eating that amount of Pop-Tarts and junk foods and I learned a lot from that. But I think they could do it with better carbohydrates. So what works for performance, what works for bodybuilding, is probably not optimal for longevity and health. So that's an important point. You know,
Layne winced.
For
the audio listeners only.
Okay. So I know where he's coming from, but, you know, I'd like to hear his opinion.
Yeah. So
Before you do that, why do you think that it would be an issue? What would be the issue with sugar and with Pop-Tarts and junk food? What would be the negative effects biologically?
I think the accumulation of the postprandial spikes in glucose and insulin over time, especially in the context of a calorie surplus, could be a bad thing. If you are doing a calorie surplus, for example, to gain weight and mass over time, which bodybuilders do, you know, following contest in the off season, I think it's even more important almost to actually stick with foods, carbohydrate sources that are lower glycemic. You know, you can only tolerate so much fiber, but I think if you are running a if you are doing a ketogenic diet and you have a calorie surplus, that could be a bad thing. Your triglycerides will go up. So you're putting too much fat in the system, and that.
But it would go up on a higher carb diet.
It
so
would
this
go
is me
up
defending.
on a higher carb
Yeah.
diet too. So I mean, I kind of would stay along the lines of maybe protein, but you titrate it in a reasonable amount. But I just think that the negative, you know, that could come out of that is that I'm following a blood glucose curve, right, and insulin curve, and I see this very dramatically. For example, in my student who's a type 1 diabetic, Andrew Kutnick, and he wears a Dexcom, a continuous blood glucose monitoring system, and his insulin requirements dramatically dropped with low carb, and his glucose fluctuations dramatically improved, and that's going to pay big dividends. Probably, if you have type 1 diabetes, the 10 top things on how humans die, you have a greater risk for every one of those. You know, dramatic. You know, it cuts 10 years off of your life. If the tighter you can keep your glucose levels, your blood glucose and your insulin levels, that in the long run, I feel it's going to pay big. The science still has to show that. I think it's not totally clear, but I think we can, for type 1 diabetics, which I think we can apply that data to the population, if they control their glucose levels, that pays big dividends in the long run.
Layne?
So a couple things. You actually touched on a couple of the points I was going to bring up, but I want to address one thing first, which is the higher postprandial insulin and the negative effects on health. So if you have, they've done studies on this, on BMI versus insulin. Now, BMI we can debate about how useful of a measure it is, but in general, it reflects body fat in the average population. Not in lifters, but in the average. BMI, by the way, for people who are listening, is a ratio of your height versus your weight that generally reflects obesity.
And you're obese.
I'm obese.
I'm obese.
Yes,
Yeah.
So if you lift weights
Layne
and
and
you
I are
have,
both obese.
I'm morbidly obese.
It seems so silly to me.
It is, but if you look at the general population who doesn't exercise, it's actually pretty darn accurate.
Gets factored into your insurance, though, which is not.
Does it really
sucks
to
for me.
yours?
It can.
Yeah,
And
That's
it does.
hilarious.
Yeah, it sucks.
They look at you and say you're obese.
Some insurances will do like a waist to chest measurement, which helps. But anyway, so postprandial insulin, they've looked at the relationship between people who have their BMIs and postprandial insulin. They find that people with higher BMI have higher postprandial insulin, but the opposite relationship does not hold true. People who have higher insulin do not necessarily have higher BMI, and they've done this in meta-analysis. So what that says is, again, that if you are obese, type 2 diabetic metabolic syndrome profile, that you will have elevated levels of insulin because your body's becoming insensitive to it because of all the dysfunction that we talked about. But just because you secrete higher insulin doesn't mean that you're going to have more body fat. And there was a study done actually by one of the proponents of the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis that looked at what's called Mendelian randomization, where basically the idea is you have different gene variants, like we were talking about. And if, for example, like they've done this with LDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. Most people believe that LDL cholesterol has some contribution towards heart disease. I would say it's a pretty strong, now people can
Very controversial.
Okay,
Very context dependent and individual.
When they look at these gene variants, people who have gene variants where they run lower LDL have lower rates of heart disease. People who are higher rates of heart disease.
Gene variants, yeah.
If you look at that with insulin, at best, insulin explains 10% of obesity. At absolute best. And that study actually showed a high level of bias. It was between 1 to 10%. So I'm not putting out the idea that maybe insulin has some effect.
You're talking about fasting insulin or postprandial insulin?
Overall. Okay. I'm guessing probably more so fasting.
How do they measure insulin? I mean, we have hemoglobin H1C for like
So there was another
cumulative.
There was another meta-analysis where they looked at higher carb versus lower carb diets, equating calories, looking at HbA1c, and saw that the differences in weight loss were no different, like we've discussed, when calories are equated. But also the differences in HbA1c reduction weren't different. They were the same. Now, you asked about health and consuming some of these quote unquote bad foods if you do it but you said in the context of a caloric surplus, right? Which is the important thing because they help to create a surplus. But in a deficit, what's the downside? Because kind of when you talk to people who are not ketogenic necessarily, but proponents of quote unquote clean eating, which again has no real objective definition, when you say, okay, well, a pop-tart, maybe you can lose weight on it, but it can't be good for you. Okay, well, then we have to have some objective measurement to show this by, right? Like, because otherwise it's, do you believe in magic? Okay. So if you look at processed foods, what they have found with processed foods is that you have a lower energy expenditure from them. Okay, so you have a certain amount of what we call TEF, thermic effective food. Higher protein has a higher TEF than carbohydrate and fat. Okay, so we know that higher protein diets actually cause more weight loss and better lean body mass retention. Part of that is through the increased thermogenesis of the TEF, thermic effective food. Well, with processed foods, you have a lower TEF. Okay, but that doesn't mean you can't eat any processed foods and lose weight. You can. It just means you might have to eat a little bit lower calories overall. Does that make sense?
If there was a ketogenic Pop-Tart and it was made with
It probably
almond
tastes
flour,
like shit.
we know that if we eat almonds, we're probably, or other nuts or things. Just giving an example, we don't fully digest, assimilate, and utilize those calories. They pass through us. So with a Pop-Tart, I think it's pretty high with like raw, like a salad and with nuts and things like that. Like it becomes significant over time. With a Pop-Tart, like you can basically 100% of that is going into your system and it's causing a hormonal response. So the food that we eat creates, is not only calories, but creates a hormonal response. And also from the brain perspective can change the neuropharmacology of your brain. I mean, that's how I got into the ketogenic diet, because it fundamentally changes neurotransmitter systems and reward systems and things like that.
Right, but hormones, people get so hung up on hormones. And if you look at the research data, it just doesn't support it, like with insulin and whatnot. Now, in terms of like losing weight and your what happens with leptin and ghrelin and all those kinds of things, that is a huge, one of the things we talked about before the podcast started. We had about a 30-minute podcast before we actually
pre-podcast
we warmed
outside.
up. Yeah.
Nice.
People say things like one of the reasons people are really mistrustful of kind of the calories in, calories out model is because it is viewed as two isolated variables. Calories in and calories out are separate. That's not true. Calories in affects calories out. Okay? They're a moving target. So people will say, well, I ate in a calorie deficit and I didn't lose weight. No, you ate in what you thought was a calorie deficit and you didn't lose weight. But if you didn't lose weight, it was not a calorie deficit by definition. Okay? So
unless you're retaining water or something.
Yeah. When we look at dieting, like just dieting in general, over time lowers your metabolic rate, right? So if you take somebody, they actually did a rat study, again, rats, but rats tend to respond pretty similar to humans. Would you agree with that in terms of blood glucose? I mean, you do a lot of rat studies.
I do a lot of rats and mouse studies. I think there's a lot of overlap there. Yeah,
they're a good model.
Very good.
So again, but we have to put that out there because we don't want to oversell it. They did a
depends on the context of what you're studying.
Of course, yeah. Like
you don't want to do questions.
You don't want to do
like
animal studies can be helpful, but you don't want to do like an insulin study in cows because cows are ruminants and they don't care about insulin. Anyway, they took rats, they took them through 2 diet cycles. Okay, so this is kind of back to the yo-yo dieting thing. And they looked at, when they took obese rats, dieted them down to a kind of normal level, then they basically gave them as much food as they wanted, let them eat back to their original obese level, dieted them down again to the previous level, and then let them re-eat back up. What they found was absolutely astonishing. Their food efficiency went so far up because their metabolic rate became suppressed every time they dieted down. Your body has this self-defense system that you activate every time you diet. I talk about this in my shameless plug book. So the first time they dieted, if that's the kind of 1 times rate that they lost fat at, when they let them regain it, they regained it twice as fast as they lost it. Then the second time they tried to lose it, they lost it at half the original rate. Then when they regained it the second time, they regained it 3 times as fast. Their food efficiency went way up.
Did their ability to lose it
Have you noticed
as well?
What's that?
Did their ability to lose it get exponentially faster as well?
No. It took them twice as long to lose the same amount of weight. Sorry, I probably didn't explain it very well. Yeah, it took them twice as long to lose the same amount of weight, and they regained it in 1/3 the time of the original.
So your body's getting accustomed to famine.
Exactly, because every time you diet, and we see this with yo-yo dieters who how many people do you know that seem to be perpetually on a diet?
Yeah.
But they just have that short overfeeding period in between diets. And then it really does, because every time you diet, you're activating your body's self-defense system. How many fighters do you know that every time they diet, it gets harder and harder for them to make weight?
Well, they're doing more than that. They're cutting weight. The cutting weight is ruthless. They're essentially almost dying.
Right, but the part of that is they're having to crash diet super low. So what is the signal you're telling your body? Because you have to always think about things from an evolutionary perspective. My Ph.D. advisor was great about this. He'd always ask me, his name was Dr. Don Layman, brilliant guy. And he would say, why do you think the body did this? Well, if you think about what are the regulatory mechanisms on becoming fat versus becoming too thin, right? So one danger is you starve to death. The other danger is you get so fat that a predator can come get you. Which is more dangerous in the last 20,000 years. It's famine. It's famine. So your body creates much tighter self-defense system there. So when you diet, your metabolic rate slows way down. I mean, if you've ever, these guys who cut weight, so by the time they're ready to get a fight, for example, their metabolic rate's really slow. Then what happens after they fight? They eat a crap ton of food because their ghrelin is way up, leptin is way down, insulin is way down, and they regain it really fast. Now,
I think it's safe to assume, just to interject, that if you diet for 16 weeks for a show, for example, or a contest,
or
that
anything.
What you actually educated me in like 10 years ago, and I thought there was this like post-contest rebound, and in 2 weeks there'd be this anabolic window or whatever.
You're anabolic for fat.
It actually, if you diet hard for 16 weeks to make weight, it takes an equal amount of time to get your metabolism back up to that level again. So Layne coined the term, right? Reverse dieting.
I don't know if I coined it. I probably didn't coin it.
Study this with metabolic chambers in rats and use a variety of different approaches to determine how fast it actually takes to bring your metabolism back up, and if different strategies can be used to ramp up your metabolism again.
Well, because when you regain it, you regain fat really quickly, but your metabolic rate is more sluggish to return. So they actually did a study with the Biggest Loser participants, and this is why I'm so big on what is sustainable. That it has to be sustainable. They looked at, so they lost on average quite a bit of weight. I can't remember the exact numbers, but they lost a bunch of weight over the 30 weeks because they starve them and they exercise the crap out of them. And they saw that their metabolic rate dropped 500 calories more than you would predict just by the amount of body fat and lean body mass they lose. This is what's called metabolic adaptation.
When you define metabolic rate dropping, what do you mean by that? What's the...
So we can calculate all this stuff. So your overall total daily energy expenditure, your TDEE, is made up of your basal metabolic rate, which is what you burn, like what we're doing right now, just sitting around doing nothing.
Oxygen consumption, CO2 production, too.
Actually, to be real, it's just laying down doing nothing. So basically, the energy you burn keeping the lights on, right? Okay. That's one component. It's about 50 to 60% in most people. Then you have your NEAT, which is like this, like I'm moving my hands, I'm ambulatory movement, non-voluntary movement. This stuff will actually go down when you diet. Like if you've ever been around people.
Movement will go down.
Yes.
You stop fidgeting.
Spontaneous movement goes down.
Really?
It's a huge modifier. So like if you look at, I did a DVD when I was prepping for a show back in 2010, I blink slower. I'm not kidding you. And I talk slower.
Your mind must. You were like
slower.
On Valium. Yeah. It looked like you're
right now I'm all hyped up on
in the life of Layne with that series. That was
Did you feel dumber?
Series.
Oh, absolutely. Like your body, this is your body.
Ketogenic diet would help you.
So when you think about, so there's NEAT, that's that. Then your exercise activity, which is intuitive. That's how many calories you burn exercising. And then there's what's called the thermic effect of food, which we already discussed, how much energy required to get energy out of food, okay? And all those add up to your total daily energy expenditure. And we can predict, based on equations, what your metabolic rate should be. So these people, their metabolic rate was 500 calories a day lower than it should have been just based off the weight they lost. Because if you lose muscle and you lose fat, you have less weight to carry around, right? So your metabolic rate goes down just from that. But it goes down way more than it should. That is the first prong of your body's self-defense system to stop you from starving yourself, is to become more efficient. We hear the word efficiency and we think, wow, that's a good thing. Think about if your body fat levels were a gas tank and you had a car, okay? You would not want to be efficient, right? You'd want to have one of the old Suburbans that was like half a mile per gallon, right? You don't want the Prius because you can go way longer. So going back to that study on rats, they became so much more efficient with their food. And this is the second prong of your body's self-defense system, is to not only slow down your metabolic rate while you're dieting, but to start activating systems that deal with restorage once you actually start overeating again. Have you ever done a long diet or known somebody who did it and then they start eating again? It's like everything sticks to you. It's like you're like, how did I gain 5 pounds from one day? And people are like, oh, it's water. Well, water doesn't stay around for 6 months, so it's not water. That is your body preparing all these systems. So even like enzymes that deal with fat storage while you're dieting actually go up because it's preparing your body for restorage. And then even probably the most interesting thing is
So this all falls back on the importance of tracking macros, which is completely ignored with guys coming off of a fight or fitness competitors.
Right, you don't
like
just
that.
want to let yourself blow up really quickly.
It's a myth that your body is set up to be anabolic or to gain muscle.
Well, it is
you're
for
set
fat.
up for fat. Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is that the way most people diet, which is this kind of, I mean, you've probably been around people who do this yo-yo stuff. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
They pick the next fad diet, whatever's popular. They do it, they lose some weight, and then they regain it. My dad lost 30 pounds on the ketogenic diet, regained 50, right? Now, the real problem is
Did he track his macros?
Now he does. But the real problem, and he's down 30 pounds again. But the real problem is, if we used to think adipose tissue was like a sponge, right? So if you ate too much, you just threw more in there, right? Soaked up extra nutrients. And then if you were in a caloric deficit, you were losing weight, it just gave up some of its nutrients, like the guy who fasted for 365 days and didn't die because he had so much fat. We now know that body fat fits every definition in the endocrine system. It's a tissue. It is an actual organ because it sends out hormonal signals. It integrates hormonal signals. It talks to the brain, the hindbrain, the arcuate nucleus. It is integrated in all of metabolism in a big way. And typically, you have the way we gain fat or lose fat is based on the fat cell size. So you have a set number of fat cells, and they either expand or they shrink. Pretty intuitive. Unless now you can create more fat cells if you become so obese that you literally can't stuff any more fat in there, right? So obese people have fat cell hyperplasia a lot of times. What's really interesting is people at the end of a diet, when your thyroid hormone is lower, your sympathetic nervous system tone is lower, this unique hormonal milieu, if you overfeed too rapidly, there's a researcher named McLean out of Colorado that showed that you can actually increase your fat cell number if you overfeed too rapidly right after a diet. Now, this was in rats, full disclosure, but it was some fascinating stuff.
You're increasing the total.
Now you're increasing your body's, but it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Right.
Your body's like, shit, we had this famine. We don't want to deal with this shit again. We want to make sure that we can store as much stuff as possible. So we're going to create some new, this dude is rapidly overfeeding. We're going to create some new fat cells to make sure we're not going to miss any of this energy. We're going to capture every single bit of it.
I like what you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense. You're talking about weight loss and weight gain, but you were specifically discussing hormonal changes in the body due to the ketogenic diet that are beneficial, and that these hormonal changes and the changes to the way that the brain functions would be a benefit of following that diet versus just working on calories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's that book I gave you, The Complete Book of Ketones by Dr. Mary. Yeah. So that's, I don't think it's actually out yet. But,
contest prep guide.
Yeah.
I want to get jacked. Look at that.
So ketones are
handsome man on there.
They are sort of by definition have a metabolic superiority as a fuel source. And they readily cross the blood-brain barrier. They can largely replace glucose as a primary energy source in your brain under periods of fasting or ketogenic diet. So that offers a lot of advantages to someone dieting because it makes you resilient. Like the guy that fasted 382 days, his glucose was like 30 and dipped down to 20. That would be universally fatal for most people, but his ketones were elevated, so he did not feel hunger. So that is like the Cahill studies, George Cahill studies at Harvard Medical School, where they fasted subjects for 40 days. They injected insulin to increase.
What IRB did that get past?
Yeah. I remember presenting this at Layne's camp a while back, and when I read this study, I had to call him on the phone. He passed away in 2012, but we had a number of conversations before he passed away. And I was amazed that he got ethics approval to do that because it's basically like killing someone, injecting 20 IUs of insulin. But what was fascinating that they were asymptomatic for hypoglycemia at a level of hypoglycemia that's typically universally fatal. And they were also very cognitively lucid. And that was a dramatic demonstration at the time. It was thought that, the brain could only use glucose. So this is a paradigm shift in the way we understand sort of fuel utilization, particularly in the brain. So that has major, and I can go kind of on and talking about the different applications of the ketogenic diet, which I did on the first podcast. But from a perspective of someone dieting to lose weight, dieting as a lifestyle, doing intermittent fasting, the ketogenic diet makes intermittent fasting much easier because your brain's adapted to it. That for me had tremendous practical applications that allowed me, I feel, to excel through academia. I was able to do a lot more work, not get hungry, and you know, Layne, we haven't trained in a while, but when we trained, I remember last time we did deadlifts. I mean, we were both deadlifting 675 for reps, and I was on the classical ketogenic diet then. That's when I was just doing it. And it, you know, I would
classical versus
like 80 to 90% fat. You know, I was doing that for about a year.
Super high fat.
And, you know, deadlifting like 3 times my body weight for reps, you know, and it didn't hurt me. I can't say that would be the case for everyone, but I also titrated the calories in that. I wasn't really at a calorie deficit. I lost a little bit of weight. So I guess by definition, I was at a calorie deficit.
Now, for people that are thinking about gains, that are trying to gain weight, they would think that the ketogenic diet, that 80 to 90% fat, would not be enough protein.
I believe that the ketogenic diet shines when you are in a calorie deficit. My mentor for the cancer work, Tom Seyfried, had published a study showing an unrestricted ketogenic diet can actually promote cancer growth in a brain tumor model.
Unrestricted meaning too much calories?
Yeah, they were feeding mice a sugary ketogenic formula that was on the market at the time. Well, it was a sweetened. I'm sorry, it was a sweetened ketogenic formula with hydrogenated fats and other things. Yeah, it was I sweetened with aspartame or something like that. So mice tend to overeat it, and when they overeat it, you know, it creates a plethora of metabolic abnormalities. But
you also get those same abnormalities when you overeat carbs.
You do.
See, here's me being...
Just as a side note, how much does it drive you guys crazy when you hear about this fat acceptance thing, or fat is healthy? When
be fat?
Yeah, there's so much of this going around
today.
Do you
want to hear
see massively obese people, and they're trying to say it's okay, it's fine, you're healthy.
Well, there's football players, right? I mean, by definition, they're pretty healthy. I mean, they lift, they train, metabolically, their blood work kind of looks okay.
Well, they have guts. But they're not morbidly
I might
obese.
surprise you with my answer.
Okay.
We talked about this earlier. I'll take the heat. I'm a libertarian. So if somebody says I'm fat and I'm happy and I like my life and I know what the risks are, then I say knock yourself out. I'm not me for to judge what makes somebody else happy. But now the problem is if you complain about being fat, then you got to do something about it. Otherwise, I'm not going to have any patience for that.
And it goes back to the discipline issue.
Right. But you can be fit but fat.
Yes.
Because you have morbidly obese people. Like I said, if you lose 10% of your body weight, there's overweight people who run marathons.
Oh, yeah, Bert Kreischer.
You can't tell me they're not in shape.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no, for sure. It's just you're just carrying extra weight.
I mean, look at Daniel Cormier. He's not obese. But he has some...
He's fat.
Don't come get me, Dan.
Listen, when Daniel fought Stipe Miocic, he was more than 40 pounds over his fighting weight as a light heavyweight champion. And he was actually heavier than Stipe.
It serves a practical function.
He's a good friend of mine.
But performance is not the same thing as aesthetics. Let me tell you what.
He's in tremendous shape.
When I looked like that, I looked amazing.
You felt like shit.
I felt like shit.
You were ready to pass out, right?
Like literally, for me to stand up was. I remember being on the couch and there was some show on. Get on biolane.com. There was a stupid show on TV, and the remote was like, goes back to NEAT. There was a remote over there, like 5 feet away. I sat and watched the whole show because I just didn't feel like getting the fucking remote. So,
isn't it ironic because you look so good? Like when you jacked like that, you look like you just fucking run forever.
I can't
break through walls.
Now there is a threshold, like some of the Ray Williams, who is the world's best powerlifter. I mean, he looks obese. Dude squats legit 1,080 pounds.
Isn't that an issue, though, with powerlifters, though? A good percentage of them carry around a lot of body fat.
It's not as much as you would think anymore. Like in the super heavyweights, yes, because like, for example, the IPF, which is kind of the IOC-recognized powerlifting federation that I compete in, their cutoff for super heavyweights 265. So if you're going to be a super heavyweight, you might as well just be 350,
Who's that dude, Jamie?
That's Ray.
Yeah.
That's Ray.
Look at the bar bending.
Dude, he's a
Good
beast.
Lord.
He's a beast. Shout out
Size
Ray.
of that gentleman.
Super nice guy. Blaine Sumner, another one. But like when I hit my squat record of 668 at 205 pounds, I mean, I was in pretty good shape for that. But for me to get to like 8% body fat, no problem. For me to get from 8% to, and I'm calipering, so but for me to get from 8% to 3%, it's a fucking nightmare. Your body, again.
Did you really get down to 3?
On calipers. Yeah. So
what do you think that would be if you floated?
No, there are no actual accurate measures of body fat. That's a
What?
Not really. Like relatively within themselves, they're accurate.
Because it's dependent upon hydration and a bunch of other factors.
Yes. So people, not to make too much of a side tangent, but people look at DEXA, dual X-ray absorption technology, and they say, oh, that's the gold standard. DEXA is actually really finicky. Like I remember DEXing rats in studies. We do it in duplicate. So we do it twice. And sometimes you'd have like differences just DEXing the same rat twice. It depends on the machine, your hydration status, because water, if you want to gain, you know what the best way to gain 8 pounds of lean body mass within 5 minutes? Go do a DEXA, then drink a gallon of water, go back, do another DEXA. You'll be 8 pounds lean body mass heavier.
You can impress your friends.
Because it's a 2-compartment model.
Get more lean body mass.
It's a 2-compartment model. Same thing with calipers. It's only measuring your amount of fat tissue. So anything that's not fat is lean body mass. So if you guys are using that to track progress, if anybody uses that to track progress, it's only accurate relative to the measurement. So your calipers mean nothing for what your DEXA measurement's going to be, and vice versa.
I see.
But the change, like if I'm calipering consistently at 10%, and then it drops to 8 and then 7, and I can be relatively confident that I'm losing body fat. Same thing for DEXA. But you have to do it at the same time of day, same hydration status, all that kind of stuff. And I don't really use DEXA because people, in order to get it accurate, you'd have to use it like every day for it to be actual relative.
You use pictures, right? So when he was dieting and got to a certain
way
point,
off tangent here, but
like I looked at him, I was like, okay, yeah, like stop there. But then he would go for another and get to a level where he looked very gaunt. I mean, you looked, but what looks good there, like seeing him in person, like I knew his personality was changing. I mean, it was kind of freaky, disgusting looking towards the end. And many people who maybe follow the sport but don't compete don't really realize what the difference between 5% or 6% and 3% is.
Yes.
So that separates the competitors from the bros online.
You're really fighting evolution at that point because your body is you're close to starvation, literally. Your body's trying to keep you from doing that. So like you think about food all the time. You actually become, so a friend of mine, Chris Foss, he's a professor now. He was doing his Ph.D. at the same time as me. And him, my other friend, Dr. Jeremy Lineker, and Dr. Lindy Rousseau, Chris's wife. Chris was doing a contest prep, and I prepped him for the show. And it was a 6-month study he's a natural bodybuilder, so drug-free. And they looked at the hormonal responses, his weight, his body fat, and even like measures of mood. Chris is like
this guy was a beast too, like 260 or something. I mean, natural drug-free bodybuilder. Right?
220 in the off season, about 190 on contest.
Okay, he did look like he.
But he's a big guy. Yeah. But he's like a very mellow dude. By the end, his mood measurements were measuring like that of a psychopath.
Really?
Yeah, it just changes your mood that much.
You've
probably been around fighters who like when they get that lean, it's just like
they can barely talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And think about like they're actually like trying to peak for a fight at the same time they feel the most like shit.
It's ridiculous.
They're so focused on cardio they can't. I don't want to make this into a.
They're focused on just dehydration.
Yeah,
really,
and
just making that weight.
I've seen some of the protocols. There's some good ones out there, but some of the stuff I've seen, I'm like, God, I wish I could talk to somebody in that realm because it's so much bro science.
It's so dangerous too, and it's really you can only do it 3 or 4 times, and then your body starts to reject it, and these guys have to go up and wait, like you were talking about.
We explained to you why, and guess what happens when they go up and wait? Sometimes, they start crushing it.
Yeah, they do much better.
So
his testosterone, right, went plummeted, but his basal requirements, his caloric requirements, was like 1,200.
The crazy thing is. So there have been some critics of my kind of view of metabolic adaptation, the body's self-defense system, full disclosure. Some people criticize me about that. They say, well, if you look at metabolic adaptation, it only explains, it's only a 15% adaptation relative to the whole adaptation. And but if you look at Chris's numbers, I think on average that's probably right. on an average diet with an average person. You take somebody trying to get really lean, or somebody who yo-yo diets, or somebody who crash diets, and now, if, again, it's proportionate. If you challenge your body with something extreme, it's going to respond in an extreme fashion. So every case study we have on natural bodybuilders, and there's about 10 of them now, who look at their contest preparation and coming out of it, and I use them just because this is the realm I grew up in, shows that they're hypogonadal by the time that they're at stage. So
hypogonadal mean their balls are shrinking?
Their testosterone is clinically low.
Yeah.
Naturally. And these are guys like me. I actually I actually like have a pretty naturally high testosterone level. Like when every time ever since I'm 16 years old, when I've got it tested, I've been like over 800 if I'm eating enough. When I was at contest, I was under 300. This is part of how your body fights you. Your body does not want you to be that lean. But if you're kind of reining this back into the discussion, this is why I talk about why it's so important to pick something that's sustainable for you as an individual. Because if you do this shit where you yo-yo diet or you don't come out of it appropriately, it will fuck you up. I mean, we've all...
I think females especially have a lot of track record.
Like I've worked with a lot of females now because especially in physique sports, there's a lot of really bad coaching, starvation diets.
Well, for women, it just messes with your reproductive cycle too, right?
Yeah.
Stop having periods.
Amenorrhea.
Yeah. Which amenorrhea in of itself doesn't seem to have necessarily.
What is that?
No menstrual cycle.
Oh.
Yeah. So doesn't necessarily in of itself seem to be have negative health consequences in terms of longevity or disease or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, if you can't get pregnant, I mean, that's a big deal for some women. But what the women don't want to hear is you may have to gain some body fat to get that back. They don't want to hear that. But this is why, like, I really start with sustainability. And then from there, I go to, okay, so if we got what's sustainable for you, now can we get a little bit better? Can we do a little bit more fiber? Like, I think in general, I criticize paleo diets because I think their validation for their model is absolutely fucking stupid.
What validation is that?
Oh, the kind of the evolutionary validation and the fact that we didn't drink milk and we didn't eat beans and this kind of thing.
Didn't have coffee.
But the question shouldn't be what we were doing. The question should be what makes sense and what is healthy now. Like if you look at studies on dairy, almost all studies show people who take in dairy are healthier, better bone density, more lean body mass, lower body fat.
But aren't there a lot of people that think that dairy is bad for you?
Yeah.
Dairy causes inflammation.
Mostly vegans. But
is that really?
There, some like clean eaters too think that dairy somehow causes the research data actually. Yeah,
well,
shows the exact
protein in dairy, various proteins that alpha-lactalbumin or beta that can basically initiate an immune response in the body. So I know when I'm okay with dairy fat, I can get 100 grams a day of dairy fat. But if I drink a whey protein shake, especially at night, I wake up all congested and like I have an allergy.
Is that a pure whey concentrate?
Whey concentrate, or just like. A yogurt and I think it's a spectrum, right? So it's not like you have it or you don't. I think, there's this spectrum, and bovine protein is kind of viewed foreign to the body. I mean, once it enters the bloodstream, it can.
It's only if it enters the bloodstream, because if digestion is working properly, you're not going to get any of that in the bloodstream. It's all going to be chewed up into monodi and tripeptides.
Some of it makes, insulin's a 50 amino acid, and if you take enough insulin, you can basically go hypoglycemic if you orally consume it. That's why you inject.
I think it's 80. I think it's 81.
81? I thought it was 50.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Short.
I teach on it. Yeah. So even something that's 50 amino acids
now
or
I have
more
to know this.
can get through.
So this term lactose intolerance. Do you think
that's actually an enzyme. That's actually
a sugar. Yeah.
So this is an issue with people's individual dietary systems.
So some people have alpha-lactalbumin sensitivity, where they if they've got some kind of leaky gut. So normally your injunctions are tight. Okay, so your small intestine or your intestines are like kind of fingers, and they pick up nutrients. I'm really generalizing.
The epithelial cells, the tight junction is a little anchor that holds them.
If something's dysfunctional with that can allow certain nutrients through the wall, and that will initiate a body's immune response. Holly is celiac, and she so if she has gluten, you will know it because she will have a huge inflammatory response. But in people who have normal digestion, that just doesn't happen. going back to the paleo thing, what I was going to say is, even though I disagree with their relevance, if you told me, okay, you take their general recommendations, limit sugar, eat more whole foods, eat higher protein, I think in general that's pretty good recommendations for most people. I just, as you said, I'm anti-bullshit, so I'm not going to let you make claims about why something works when that's not why it works, right? So when we look at like the differences in diets, like I think what I would say generally to people is, here's the great news. As far as fat loss goes and health markers, if you want to lose weight, if you control your calories, so you eat in a calorie deficit, you eat enough protein, because protein helps spare lean body mass and is thermogenic, so it increases your energy output, then you can kind of do whatever you want with carbs and fats and whatever you prefer, and you'll still lose the same amount of weight and get about all the health benefits. But it has to be something that you can sustain, because if you can't sustain it, you're going to put all that weight back on. That's what the research data shows. So Dom loves
sustaining it, meaning
do it for
having a
life.
balanced diet that you could stick with versus
Do it for life.
some sort of calorie deficit that's really only a temporary thing to lose weight.
Right. So now obviously you can't eat in a deficit forever, right? Because then you would starve yourself to death.
Right.
But the body corrects that. Like as you drop body weight, your metabolic rate slows down. You're not in a calorie deficit forever. When we talk about losing weight and then maintaining it, right? So eating at a maintenance. So eating, basically, the behavior you use and the style of dieting you use, you have to continue that if you want to maintain it. So if you like ketogenic, and I think you're a big fan of meat. If you can sustain that, like people out there say, oh my God, people will probably tell you, you're going to get cancer and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. Most of those health benefits are just from not having excess body fat. Excess body fat and the metabolic dysregulations of a metabolic type syndrome, that's what cause 90% of these problems. Okay? Now,
which is why I get crazy when people say that fat is healthy.
Well, here's the problem. It's like we have like reactionary culture. So we have
Depends where your set point is too, though.
Right. We have reactionary culture. So you see this all the time. Mm-hmm. So we had, okay, you got to eliminate saturated fat, you got to eliminate dietary fat, and just eat grains and limit your proteins. And we got fatter. And so the reaction to that was, don't eat any carbs. Saturated fat isn't bad for you. In fact, eat as much saturated fat as you can. It's great. Put butter in your coffee. Like, no, there's good data to show that. The research data that I've seen, in my opinion, shows that saturated fat absolutely was demonized. It's not as bad as we thought. But if you eat too much of it, it's not great either.
Especially with carbohydrates.
Oh, absolutely. Because now you're increasing your liver production of saturated fats as well.
Right. When your body gets to a fat burning stage, and then on top of that you pile on carbohydrates, then your body wants to store those carbohydrates as well.
With a calorie surplus.
Well, you actually technically you store the fats.
You store the fats.
Yeah, because carbohydrate.
You burn the carbohydrates to store them.
Right. So carbohydrate. If you say, well, if you don't store carbohydrates, so I talk about this in my book, because people will go too far to each direction. They'll say, well, you said you hardly store any carbohydrate as actual fat. Why don't we eat zero fat and mostly carbohydrate? Well, then your body's not dumb. You didn't get here today and get through evolution and tens of thousands of years of hard, living by your body being stupid. So your body can ramp up de novo lipogenesis, so that you can create fat from carbohydrate if fat gets low and carbohydrate intake gets high enough.
Essential fatty acids you need
but
from your diet.
There was a research study or a meta-analysis done by Kevin Hall, who's an NIH researcher, and they showed that if you equate calories, you get a small extra benefit from fat restriction versus carb restriction on fat loss. So you get about 26 grams extra fat loss per day, calories equated, protein equated, if you restrict fat versus carb. Now, before everybody goes crazy, that's probably due to a little bit of inefficiencies in ramping up de novo lipogenesis, because it takes energy to move that system. But 26 grams of fat loss per day, to me, is not a physiological, I don't care about that. That's nothing compared to, okay, if you like low carb better, don't worry about losing an extra 26 grams of fat. If you like low carb better and you can sustain that, then do low carb.
One of the things that we seem to be getting into here is the difference between losing weight and optimal performance, and then optimal performance mentally and hormonally versus optimal performance physically in terms of like athletic pursuits.
So here's something
and the type of person, whether it's, you don't want to put a teenager that's, playing football on a ketogenic diet necessarily.
And why would that be?
Well, maybe if they're overweight, that could be beneficial, but I think it would decrease his performance unless he goes through the keto adaptation phase. But there's a lot of when you're a teenager, I would say your carbohydrate tolerance is very high.
I want to address this after you're done.
Mine was very high. I could eat huge plates of pasta that I could not eat now. I just simply couldn't. So I think as we age, I would say our carbohydrate tolerance decreases with age because our metabolic machinery is not as hungry for glucose. I mean, we're set up, and hormonally, our insulin sensitivity is not as high, glycolytic pathways are reduced, things like that. That happens as a consequence of age. So it makes sense that as we transition into age for longevity and for health span, maybe not lifespan, but health span, carbohydrate restriction makes sense. And even in some cases, a ketogenic diet makes sense,
But if you look at so I have two pushbacks on that. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I kind of am. But if you look at longevity data, the actual longevity data, people who restrict fat versus carb live longer. Like that's what a new study that came out showed. But again, there's
I'm describing it as also a means of because people put on weight as they age with a low carb and with a ketogenic diet, that becomes a practical strategy to create a sustainable calorie deficit for losing weight, sustaining that. And also if you elevate ketones over time, a lot of the new research that's coming out, over the last 5 years, ketones is not just a superior source of energy metabolically, but it also has epigenetic effects on the body. It activates gene pathways that can confer resistance against oxidative stress, the longevity pathways, anti-inflammatory pathways.
But in the context of a deficit?
No, not in the context of deficit.
Really?
You could feed ketones, take a ketone supplement, and it activates just simply elevating beta-hydroxybutyrate functions as a histone deacetylase inhibitor and can activate, if you will, gene programs that can confer resistance against many different things, oxidative stress pathways, and also activate or suppress an inflammatory pathway that's linked with many age-related chronic diseases and autoimmune pathways. It decreases the activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome. So
when you're talking about people living longer, you're talking about that epidemiology study that was like a questionnaire of people, what they ate over a long period of time. Highly criticized study.
Absolutely.
Here,
and there's a lot of co-founders, which is why I'm not a big fan of
But it's hard to say that the study shows that if you eat carbs versus fat, that you live longer.
I didn't say one was cause and effect.
But you sort of cited it as a piece of evidence.
Because I don't cherry pick. Because if we're going to give the argument, I want to give the whole argument. I was playing devil's advocate. I don't think that necessarily if you eat a low carb diet, it's going to cause you to live a shorter life. I don't believe that.
Okay.
But I think it's important to put all the data out there because what I see a lot of is people just cherry picking, and I hate that.
With those studies, they become
there's tons of
clickbait,
co-founders,
and everybody wants to say, eat carbs, you live longer. Low-fat diets are going to kill you, and then it just gets crazier.
Here's
crazier.
Why some of the animal work. I mean, Layne and I both did animal work. I think some of the animal work is almost more reliable because you have an inbred strain of animal and you have very tight control. If
they're genetically identical.
Freely living human, he's doing many different things and there's genetic variability. But with animals, it may not always be predictive. It's informative, but not always predictive. And I think some of the data, I read some of the human studies and become more confused. But going back to the animal data, I'm almost more comfortable with some of these outcomes for animal studies.
So one thing I want to bring up that I think is really important is I think we're all getting to this point, and people out there think that there's like this perfect diet that's going to cure everything and all of our ails. The uncomfortable truth and the fact of the matter is that if one diet is, and I don't know this specifically, but my guess is if one diet is better for cancer, it might be worse for heart disease. Or if one diet is better for insulin resistance, Maybe it's worse for cancer.
One diet is better for cognitive performance. It might be worse for performance.
We don't know. Yeah. So it's kind of, where is your space at? And this is why I go back to those big picture things of most of the health benefits just come from having more muscle, lift weights. People out there, lift weights. If you're debating about diets and you're not lifting weights, you are fucking missing the point. Okay? Because that is, sorry, I curse. So that
Internet, you're allowed to curse.
Yeah, I do it on Twitter. You've seen me.
Yes.
So it's very good at emphasizing your point.
Yes.
So
I'm a fan of it.
Awesome. Fucking awesome. So somebody criticized me for one day. I was like, you know what's great about my job? I can say fuck as much as I want and nobody's going to fire me. So
that is great.
But the big picture things, lift weights, create more lean body mass, be active. That's a huge thing. Even if you're overweight, if you're active, you're going to live fine. On the whole, you're going to live longer than person who's inactive. And then control your weight. So if you can if you can get to a normal weight and maintain it, normal body fat and maintain it, or if you're a high body fat, if you can get to a lower body fat and maintain it, that's 95% of the battle. All this other stuff is 5% that we're worrying about, that we're going back and forth about. And that's why I don't want to miss the context, because when people like, I'll pick on him because he was who I asked for, was Gary Taubes, but I'm happier we got Dom for this.
But I'm going to just interject.
Hang on.
Okay.
Wait. So when people like Gary Taubes say things like carbs are causing obesity, just carbs, you create this problem where if people don't like eating a high-fat diet or a low-carb diet and they can't sustain it, they just feel like they're a big failure. And they just quit. Because what's the point? If carbs are causing fat and I can't stop eating carbs, what am I going to do?
I have a real hard problem with that.
Well, I know what you're saying. Discipline, it's important.
It just sounds like nonsense.
But I think my point is that if you give people flexibility, it usually improves adherence.
Right, and you're talking about from the standpoint of you coaching people.
Right, and what I would like to see is a diet that's protein and calorie protein calorie controlled. If anybody knows of one that has done this, let me know. Protein and calorie controlled, and then let people self-select higher carb or higher fat. What do you prefer? Let them self-select and see how well they do. And I bet you would see improvements in adherence in both groups.
Dom, you were going to...
Well, I think a diet strategy that controls your appetite and does not have your appetite controlling you, which I think is accomplished with a ketogenic diet. That's also, one that's a well-formulated one that controls, that has fiber and adequate protein, is a strategy that allows you to be far less fixated on food. Because you're not as hungry and you could decrease your meal frequency. So I know there's people out there that are probably busy people, CEOs of companies, students or whatever, that simply do not have time to prepare and eat meals when they get hungry. So by reducing meal frequency, you can increase your productivity. And I think you're kind of coaching your body to be a better fat burning. I think there's definitely benefits. So when you are on a ketogenic diet, you are storing more fat, but you are burning more fat.
Yes.
So think about your adipose tissue as little bags, which have fat coming into them and fat leaving them. And the fat oxidation pathways are elevated. And when I eat a ton of fat at night before I go to bed, I am like some people carb load. I'm like fat loading at night. And I'm pulling off those fat stores during the day through my adipose.
You do this purposely?
I think about it like that. So instead of just, carbing up at nighttime, I would wake up hungry. I would probably dump insulin and then wake up with a hypoglycemic cravings in the middle of the night if I did that.
Do you do time-restricted eating?
Yeah, like today, like I'm fasting. And most days that I want to be as productive as possible, I will not have my first meal, which will be typically a ketogenic meal around 4 p.m.
And so what time do you eat at night?
I'll do a small meal like at work, and then I'll eat my big meal at about 7 o'clock, maybe 7 o'clock, and then snack throughout the night and maybe eat within, I start eating at 4 p.m. and I finish eating at about 10 p.m.
So you basically start eating at the end of your day.
Yeah.
Mm. So.
And that's very liberating for me. So, and I didn't even know this was possible.
But that's
like back 10 years ago. I didn't know it was possible to have that amount of control over my appetite and actually feel as lucid and as energetic and be able to, get with Layne and do deadlifts with him and actually maintain my performance and my strength in the gym. I don't feel like I'm an outlier either. I think it's possible.
So I think that anecdotes are good because anecdotes cause us to look at things. But I can tell you, like, so for example, I eat usually 4 times a day, and I eat protein. Right now I'm in a gaining phase, so I'm trying to purposely gain weight, hopefully some lean body mass. I'm coming back from an injury, so trying to regain some of my lean body mass. I'm eating about 400 to 450 grams of carbohydrate a day. There are times when I'll go 7-8 hours, I won't eat, and I don't really get hungry. So, I mean, there's
about 16 hours.
I don't know. I don't know, but I don't think I would. I go some nights I'll sleep and I'll wake up and I'll go 12, 13 hours. Like I'll go in sometimes and I don't usually get hungry. Now, but again, that's
Why
just
do you think that is?
just well, if you look at some of the things that I'll disagree with are the idea that insulin has these big fluctuations and you become hypoglycemic and that causes overfeeding. In some people, that's the case, but most people, if they're eating especially with a higher protein diet, that doesn't usually happen.
I want to add that the population, most people are not bodybuilders, and the population of people that Layne mostly communicates with are on the border of being metabolically elite and also have a very high carb tolerance. If you're a bodybuilder with a large amount of lean body mass, you are pretty much metabolically set up to be have a high carb tolerance. So the general population is not like that.
So let's talk about carb tolerance, because that's one thing that we'll disagree on. I don't think that people are more or less carb tolerant. I think that people have slower and faster metabolic rates. So if you have a faster metabolic rate, you'll be more carb tolerant by default because you can just tolerate more calories.
I agree with that.
But
and a bodybuilder that's 220
pounds,
pounds
on average,
is going to be
on average. Yep. Now, if you look at somebody who's on a ketogenic diet, they're actually, by definition of carb tolerance, they're carbohydrate intolerant, because if you challenge them with a bolus of glucose, they can't clear it. So, but that's just because what they're adapted to, right?
But they're fat adapted, yeah.
Agreed. So I actually, the first experimental biology we ever went to, this is why, even scientists get this shit so wrong sometimes, because they get so in their echo chamber, they don't bother to look outside of it.
Going to the gym, when we first met and went, Layne stopped and had a huge meal, which to me, I was like,
you'd feel like
what
crap.
are we doing? We're going to stop and eat before
I'll eat
we
a
go to
whole
the
pizza
gym.
before I go squat.
He eats a
Really?
big, heavy, fatty meal on the way to the
Got to
gym.
visit the bathroom about 5 times,
And-
but
I forget. I think I did eat, but it was very abnormal for me to go eat a big meal, heavy meal on the way to the gym.
Holly's like you. She hates training fed. She wants to be fasted. She feels better that way. But that's
I
the
feel much
individual
better.
differences,
Yeah.
right? That's the
Yeah.
individual differences. Part of it may be you're just adapted to that as well and what you're used to. So maybe a psychological thing, but some people may just do better that way.
Your blood is diverted to your digestive system and processes, and that's less blood for the muscle. So you're expending energy to digest, break down, and assimilate food.
That theory's been pretty debunked.
Really?
Yeah. But
Something happens.
I mean,
right?
it's just a fundamental
You got a lot of-
physiological concept that you are diverting blood
Resources.
flow to blood
job
flow in particular.
Job of a scientist is to question even those theories we hold most to be true. That's Neil deGrasse Tyson said that.
Yeah.
But it's so I think a small meal actually can be beneficial, and so but it's not like you're using
I
those
agree.
carbohydrates during the meal. You're not using the
Can
protein.
I stop you
agree.
for a second? How has it been debunked?
That they see that performance isn't worse, and that you don't like. There's
What
no
performance specifically?
there's
if you had
there's
a
not
kickbox.
there's not a limitation of blood flow because you've eaten something to the muscle. There's not a limitation of blood flow to the muscle.
Okay.
But again, some people just do better if they're fasted or have small meals. Again, it may be a psychological thing, but I like to feel like I've had a lot of food and I'm fully fueled for a long training session. But some people don't
what
feel
kind
good
of
that way.
training though? Like if you're doing something like
and that's
squats in a very controlled environment, but if you were doing something like
Might be different,
if you were doing jujitsu,
but I don't know.
you would probably throw up.
Maybe. I don't
Yeah.
know. I did it very briefly. Awesome sport. Like I
Yeah.
did it very briefly, informally. Awesome
You really
sport.
can't have a big meal and then go train. You get fucked up.
I'd probably have to
lot
run
of
to the
things.
bathroom every few minutes.
I can't work on a grant. I can't. We're not supposed to talk about guns, but if I go to the range
You're
and
not
I'm
supposed to talk
fasted,
about guns?
my
Let's
Let's talk about guns.
Well,
What
we
happened?
talked a lot before. Okay,
get a memo.
guns.
my groups are tighter. I
Really?
have better control. If I go in a fed state, I'm just not as focused.
But is that
my vision? My
Yeah.
vision is not as acute if right after a big meal as if I'm fasted 16 hours.
But this is the hard thing with anecdote, because we can't tease out whether or not that is an actual physiological thing, or whether you just feel better and you think you'll do better, so you do better.
Right.
Because the brain is unbelievably powerful. There was a study, and I may butcher it because I can't remember it exactly, but they took people who had legit allergy problems, and they gave them a sugar pill, and they said, this will improve your allergies. It should not have done anything. Over half the people reported that their symptoms got better, and 30% actually physiologically got better because their brain was telling them, get better. Like, it's pretty crazy. So that's part of probably the best diet for you might be the diet you can stick to and just feel real positive about, right? Because
So you feel like this might be some of what's going on with a lot of this low carb stuff, that people say they feel so fantastic because there's some sort of a placebo effect?
that's possible. I think part of it is too is
That's
that
why
you
animal
lose.
studies give me more confidence.
Right.
When I can look at rats or mice on a ketogenic diet and see an objective increase or decrease in a parameter, then I gain confidence.
But here's the thing: I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. If you feel good about it, that's
Sure.
great. But just don't try to get on Twitter and tell everybody, "Oh, you're going to gain fat in a
Right.
deficit because you're eating carbs."
Right.
Shut up.
If you go to a witch doctor and you really believe it might actually help you.
Yes. One of the number one characteristics of cancer survivors is that they're they have a belief in God. They believe that they're going to make it through. That now, some people cause or effect. Some people may argue, religious people may argue, well, they believe in God and so God is helping them. The other argument to that is they believe that they are going to make it through there, and so they have a better likelihood of doing it. So your brain is very powerful.
That believe in the ketogenic diet and believe in God, and I think that's a great thing.
And they fly. They fly.
They have remarkable. I believe that I'm a person of faith, but I also believe that if you have faith in the methodology too, the patients that have communicated with me that actually believe that this approach is going to work, and then they reach that actual therapeutic state of ketogenic diet, have results that kind of defy what you would expect scientifically. So I believe it's working physiologically and also psychologically. There's immunopsychotherapy, right, or immunology. So our brain can actually control many different physiological processes, including our immune system.
Yes.
And that is something that's underappreciated and understudied, and that really needs to be studied.
Now, in terms of eating a large meal before training, surely your body has to use up some of the resources to digest. You don't think that it's blood flow to the muscles? You think that's been debunked?
They show that the blood flow to the muscle is not limiting if you've had a meal before you train. Okay. Now, the thing is, but some people don't like that. It's a very individual thing. It may be a psychological thing with me. I understand that I'm an idiot like everybody else out there, right? So I'm subject to bias and psychological influence like anybody else. But I just use that to my advantage. If I feel good about it, why would I not do it? Now,
if you train in the morning, do you do that? Like heading to the gym first thing in the morning?
Holly tries to stop me because then I usually end up going to the bathroom for like 5 times. But I'll eat a little bit less in the morning if I'm going to go straight in and train. But one of the things that going back that so many scientists miss is that context. Like most people miss context, but scientists even miss context. So the first experimental biology symposium we ever went to, there was a poster where they fed people a ketogenic diet or they fed them a high carb diet. And then at the end of 6 weeks, they challenged them with 100 grams of glucose and looked how long it took for them to clear that glucose. The ketogenic diet people would have been worse than like type 2 diabetics at clearing glucose, okay? Whereas people eating a high carb diet cleared it just fine, right? Now, if you just looked at these numbers as a doctor, you'd be like, oh my God, you're diabetic. No, that's what they were adapted to. And I challenged the person with the poster. I said, for all you ketogenic diet people who hate me on Twitter, I defend the ketogenic diet when it is time to be defended. I said to the girl, if you had fed a high-fat meal to these people, you would have seen the same thing in reverse. if you would have fed a high-fat meal to people who were on the ketogenic diet and then a high-carb diet, you would have seen really elevated triacylglycerides, LDL cholesterol, VLDL cholesterol, chylomicrons, and people who were carb adapted because it wasn't being cleared, because that's not what you're adapted to. But people miss that whole context.
Layne has a good analogy in his book, where if you have a factory, a military factory that's making planes, and then it has to switch over to making ships, right? So it takes a lot of time to change sort of all the processes that take place. And the same thing is sort of happening. I mean, you're giving your body a different fuel source. So it has to ramp up the enzymatic machinery, the pathways, the regulatory pathways, and the transporters even to basically use those fuels.
Yeah, and a misunderstanding of that, or at least an ignorance, is one of the more frustrating things online when I hear like nonsense people, these internet air quote experts talking about the negative aspects of the ketogenic diet, that they tried it and they felt weak. Like, what do you mean you tried it? You tried it for a day? Did you try it for 3 days?
Exactly.
You tried it for a month? Like, get the fuck out of here. You don't even know
Keto
what you're
adaptation, it's
Takes
so
months.
important. Like when you review a study, and I think you have a study in your book actually that shows in the gym, you basically say the ketogenic diet can hurt your performance in the gym. So, and you reference a race walking study where I think they did the ketogenic diet for like 3 weeks or something like that. So
I think we came back around and said that it's probably fine once you're adapted to it.
Once you're adapted to it. And what's the time period we're talking about?
For me, I did not feel myself after, it took me about 3 to 4 months, but then you got to realize that there's a learning curve to doing the ketogenic diet right. So if I go back to my notes, I mean, my performance in the gym and just general well-being took about 3 to 4 months.
Do you use an app to chart your meals or anything?
I did MyFitnessPal and stuff, but I just know I'm a creature of habit. So we basically just buy the same food all the time. And I measure things on scales and stuff just as a scientist. So I can look at some powder on a scale and do 250 milligrams plus or minus, 10 milligrams. So I've measured things out to where I can look at a plate and basically give you the macros pretty tight.
Well, and that's
I don't know if you do that.
Have you ever done keto for long periods of time?
I've done it before, yeah. And
he hasn't been keto adapted though, I would argue.
I had ketones in my but I just
How long did you do it for?
About 8 weeks. So you could argue that I didn't do it long enough, but my thing is like all my blood markers are healthy. So I did keto at maintenance, and I didn't see really much improvement in anything. Everything kind of stayed the same. Now, what
feel different energy wise?
When was this? What year was this?
This would have been probably after my bodybuilding show, but before I got back into powerlifting.
Okay.
So it would have been sometime in like 2012-ish.
Did you like post about it and stuff? I want to go
Not
back.
Not really, because I didn't want to really like get the wrath of anybody on me at the time.
You just were trying it?
Now I'm old and cantankerous. I just don't care that much anymore. But my performance didn't go down that much. In the first few weeks it did, but then it was fine. Yeah. I just like the flexibility of having some carbs.
Yeah.
I liked having that flexibility because if
Layne
you're going
likes popcorn. I remember
yes, I do. Popcorn's great though because it actually has higher protein and higher fiber.
Yeah.
But if I was going to commit to it as a lifestyle, then that would be fine. But unless you're willing to, again, if that's not something you're willing to stick to for life, you have to rethink if you want to do it or not.
But there is some benefit in going on and off ketogenic diets, correct?
So if you do a ketogenic diet and you want to stay in a state of ketosis, the days that I do intermittent fasting now, which I didn't do like 5 years ago, I don't necessarily do the keto. I do a higher protein, low carb, but my macros are not ketogenic. Typically, not all the time. Sometimes they are. But there are different, like you could do intermittent fasting with a carb-based diet and still get ketones, by the end of your fast. You could do low carb. You could do ketogenic. I actually think it's a little bit better to be metabolically flexible. So I'll throw in, I tend to eat a lot of vegetables and then throw in some fruits too a few days a week, where it may kick me out of ketosis, but during the middle of the day when I need to be at my best, I pretty much I'm running low to moderate ketones during the day. And I can do that with different strategies now, with my body.
How much does that kick you out of ketosis, though? I can't imagine.
At nighttime?
Yeah. What are you eating? What are you
I
eating
might
specifically?
eat half of dark chocolate, 1 or 2 things of dark chocolate, and which is maybe 15, 20 grams of carbs, and maybe a half cup of blueberries, and then a big salad and some vegetables, typically green
So
vegetables.
when you say it kicks you out of ketosis, so if you measure your blood, your ketones drop below what level?
0.5, and
Okay.
I typically don't even measure at night, but I wake up in the morning and I might be about 0.5, and then that goes up throughout the day. So
Okay.
middle part of the day, I'm typically running between 1 to 2, sometimes 3 millimole. If I take a ketone supplement.
The urine strips are only effective in the early stages of ketosis. Is that correct?
Yeah, because in the beginning you spill out a lot of ketones in your urine, but as you increase ketone transport and utilization over time, less of them end up in your urine.
How much time is that?
Depends on the person, but after about 2 or 3 weeks, you may see less of a color change on the urine strips, even if you didn't change your diet.
Is there another effective method other than the pricking the finger?
Yeah, well, I think the blood, Abbott Labs makes the Precision Extra. There's the Keto Mojo, which I also use. We use in the lab.
What's that?
Keto Mojo is a blood measurement and glucose measurement device that's essentially, because Abbott cornered the market, they basically allow you to check your ketones for $1 a strip instead of $3 or $4 or $5.
But it's still pricking your finger.
It's pricking your finger. I don't use I actually use a syringe and just take a running start and jab my finger now because
Whoa.
it doesn't. I got calluses like you do on your fingers.
It's annoying.
Yeah, I'm kind of used to it, but the urine strip is actually pretty good relative marker, and the Siemens multi-stick SG will measure ketones and then 9 other things like that measure kidney function and your blood glucose and things like that. So I recommend it's 25 cents a strip. And then there's the breath ketonics meter. You blow into it and it measures breath acetone, and the level is also another breath acetone measurement system.
I was going to ask about that.
So yeah, and breath acetone highly correlates to fat oxidation. So if your breath acetone is high, you are burning a lot of fat. So
isn't there an issue with people that are in a state of ketosis if they get pulled over for drunk driving?
A couple of lawyers contacted me. There's some cases going on right now, and they wanted me to weigh in on that.
Breathalyzers.
Yeah.
The breathalyzers because of the, what did you say, acetone with this in your breath?
It uses the same technology, breath acetone. And I know that if you drink alcohol and do a breath ketone meter, you can kind of pin it, depending on what meter you're using. If you're using a breath, for a breath ketone meter. If you have a breath alcohol measurement and you're in a state of ketosis, I have not seen that, depending on the device, that you'll have a false positive, if that's your question. Some devices can. It depends on the device.
So one thing I'll bring up, because you said, well, you work with these kind of metabolically elite people. So one of the problems, I say what you're doing, where you kind of take yourself up to the point where you're sort of getting out of ketosis and then going back in, that's probably fine. But most people aren't going to do it that way. They're going to be like, oh, I had a cheesecake, or, oh, I couldn't take any more and I had some pizza or whatever. That's really bad.
So you see probably people who intermittent fast, decrease that window time and overconsume on, so that's a big problem.
So
actually,
I wanted to bring up intermittent fasting too, because I think, again, like so the studies on intermittent fasting show that you lose the same, if calories are the same, you lose the same amount of weight, same amount of fat, maybe might be at risk for a little bit more lean body mass loss just because you're triggering protein synthesis less often. But you do have a little bit lower insulin levels, it seems like. Now, whether or not that's, again, beneficial based on the research that we talked about.
Likely insulin sensitivity.
Insulin sensitivity was a little bit better. Again, so there's some techniques you can do, but people bring up things like autophagy and inflammation. And I kind of get... So if you just calorically restrict, you increase autophagy. And you decrease inflammation.
Yeah, but you don't get, and autophagy is dependent upon the decrease in certain amino acids, glucose, and insulin, and you achieve those biomarker states at a more significant level doing intermittent fasting than you would, and they are the autophagy regulators.
Can you send me the research for that? Because I would love to see it.
mTOR, AMP kinase, leucine. So if you are eating various meals throughout the day, 3 times a day, like, your blood leucine levels will be.
But you've always got to keep it in context of 24 hours. So
Yes.
people do this with fat storage and oxidation as well. They say, well, if you're fasting all this time, you're burning so much body fat. Well, yeah, but then by definition, if you're eating less at these times, you have to eat more at this time if you're keeping calories the same. And so during that time post-meal, you're going to store a lot more fat. You're going to have much higher insulin. Now, maybe lower overall.
And if you have a fast metabolism, you're overshooting, and those calories have to go somewhere.
So the point being, over 24 hours, you don't see differences in fat loss or fat gain, intermittent fasting versus non. I would be interested in the inflammation stuff and the autophagy stuff because, again, caloric restriction in of itself decreases inflammation, increases autophagy. Interestingly enough, one of the sugar studies they did with higher sugar, with still calorically restricted, they showed decreases in inflammation.
So it's inflammation is largely an issue of caloric restriction or the reduction of inflammation.
Excess.
Do you guys think that that's what's going on with this carnivore diet?
Yeah, it's hard now.
I think it's a calorie restriction effect, probably.
It's hard
and
to
an
overeat
elimination
meat.
diet effect.
Like, look at if I give you a plate of French fries, like 200 grams of French fries, you can get a lot of calories from that. If I give you 200 grams of meat, even a real fatty meat, it's not nearly the same. Like, you're going to be much more satiated from the protein. Mm-hmm. Like, you can only eat so much meat, you know? And again, like, I don't want to go too far down the carnivore diet hole, but the stuff I see with people, do I think you can eat meat and improve your blood markers? Absolutely. Absolutely. Of course.
You could eat pop-tarts and
yeah. But the point is like when we get into this kind of zealot of only eat meat, you don't need vegetables, you know, that kind of, there's I mean, again, it's epidemiology, but there's some really tight meta-analyses that have been done looking at colorectal cancer and low fiber intake. And I would not be comfortable recommending people not eat, enough vegetables and fiber.
But I feel uncomfortable eating a steak, or a burger without like something like broccoli or salad. I think you negate many of the potentially carcinogenic compounds that are in red meat, and that's a whole nother debate. But I think you essentially... heme iron and
polyaromatic hydrocarbons.
Yeah, Chris Kresser actually brought that up yesterday. We were talking about meat consumption with vegetables.
Yeah, like with cruciferous vegetables, broccolis and salads. Like I personally would not eat red meat.
So full disclosure, I mean, because I get accused on Twitter of being a carb guy, and I'm not. My research was funded by the Egg Board, the National Beef something or another. Sorry, guys. And then the National Dairy Council. So, full disclosure. By the way, all you guys out there who, again, you're just taking my word for it, but who think that, like, industry is this evil thing that comes in and controls everything. I met one person my entire Ph.D. from the funding sources, and I met them for literally 30 seconds. They were at it was at experimental biology, and they said, "Hi, thank you for the grant. Oh, great job, thank you." That was it. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't nefarious things that can happen, but like when I like the show with Nina, everything was about who funded it and this and that, but that's why they have to disclose those things on papers. And also, this is why science is self-regulating, because somebody is going to repeat your study, and if they don't find the same thing you found, you're going to be in trouble.
So I get criticized for conflict of interest. So I've seen it on social media and things. So I should probably say I am not a medical doctor or even a registered dietitian. I'm a Ph.D. scientist. So don't take my word as medical or nutrition advice. Our research is funded not only by the Department of Defense and Office of Navy Research, but also by companies that actually develop ketone food products and also exogenous ketone supplements. And our university owns the rights to those patents. I don't have any products myself. We have a company, Ketone Technologies, and Keto Nutrition is the information website. But at this time, we have no products, but the university licenses our intellectual property and products are made out of that, and I get patent royalties, and I put the patent royalties back into our research. So buying various exogenous ketones, products that are on the market can come back and help support the science and the application
I'm
of
just
this.
going to
So
vouch for him.
I tend not to state that, but I get called out for not stating that. So I think it's important.
I'm going to vouch
state
for
that.
him because he's actually writing a chapter in my new book. So we're going to have a chapter about the ketogenic diet. If you're going to do it, this is how to do it right. So the new book, Fat Loss Forever, shameless plug. And he said, I just want all the money that I make from the book to go back into the lab. So
Nice.
like that's
And
Dom's
Walter Longo has a similar with Prolon with his line too. I know his profits. The profits that he takes, he puts back into research.
Nobody's unbiased. Anybody that says there are is full of crap. We all have our biases. We all have things that we think work better than others.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental, if you meet a scientist, and hopefully I equip myself well in this, and I think Dom does as well, is that one, you have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. And two, you care more about getting the right answer than being right. When I went to do my Ph.D., I was eating 8 meals a day. I was eating 300 grams of protein a day. I was looking for more reasons to eat more protein and eat it more frequently. When I left my Ph.D., I ate 4 meals a day, and I ate a little bit less protein and less frequently. And
you're
because
becoming
that was
refractory to the
the
amino acids.
refractory phenomenon.
I was
we
eating
came across.
500 grams of protein a day. I was eating like 2 or 3 2-pound London broils and washing it down with a product, Metrics with HMB in it, like
That
in
was-
between meals, like back in the mid to early 90s.
Your farts
And that was
must
the-
have been
insane.
brutal.
And that was the
I
coolest thing.
digested it well, actually. Yeah.
That was the coolest thing about my research was it changed the way I ate. I actually changed the way I ate and responded. But I that was my bias coming in. But I looked at the research data. And I'm like, either I believe this or I don't. And if I believe this, I can't justify X, Y, Z.
Right. Can I go back to the epidemiology studies when in regards to colon and rectal cancer? There really haven't been any studies on people that just eat meat, though, right? You're talking
No.
about people who eat meat on a regular basis, and that usually is the standard American diet. A lot of other bullshit in there, sugar, buns,
And there's tons of
French fries,
co-founders.
trans fats.
Absolutely.
Right. I would be fascinated to see some sort of long-term study on someone who's on a very strict carnivore diet. I'm really fascinated by this because I'm seeing all these people have all these benefits, but I've got skeptical hippo face every step of the way. I'm like, I'm not.
Now, again, if it's allowing them to create a caloric restriction,
Yes.
right? And somebody says, you know what? I've tried every other diet out there. I've tried to eat high fiber and I've tried to eat enough vegetables, and I can stick to this.
Right.
And I can lose some fat. Then I'm going to say, okay, well, maybe that's the best diet for you.
Well, I just know so many people that are benefiting from it, like and not just the people
Part
that
of
have
that-
been on the podcast so far. I know a lot of other people.
And if they're
Remember-
followed by a doctor and collecting blood work along the way, I mean, those doctors can write case reports. So I'd be glad to assist in a case report if people are tracking all their blood markers and doing their blood work.
Most of the
and things
people
like that.
aren't, though. That's what's
Yeah.
going on. Most of these knuckleheads are just eating meat and saying they feel great, and
Well-
there's a war on vegetables. Like
Well,
it's very strange.
Remember that people don't discount psychology. People are feeling
Right.
very positively about it because it's the flavor of the month.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I'm no hate towards carnivore. I don't know who I think Dr. Baker
Sean Baker,
is the
yeah.
one big guy. But like if I
Even dogs eat grass. I mean, my dogs go out and eat around the grass,
Not
to
cats,
get
though.
some.
Not cats. Cats are pure
are
carnivores.
obligate
Yeah.
carnivores. Yeah. definitely.
So cats, interestingly, are one thing that they don't. There is a carb tolerance with them. They don't tolerate them well. They become obese.
Yeah.
But
Hashtag vegan cat.
so
seen it.
I think the thing is that I don't believe in any one diet. I'm not trying to sell any one diet.
I would like to sell
But if-
you on a ketogenic diet. I really want to see you do it for like 4 or 5 months just to see if you're experiencing the same benefits as him. 'Cause
I
it
actually-
seems pretty obvious that you really haven't done it like whole hog.
I agree with that totally, and I think I could probably put together a meal plan
I did
with
it.
keto cookies and things
So-
like that.
Oh,
Where
these
you can
fucking cookies.
But see, but I like my cookies. I did.
food technology.
You like real
Hang
cookies.
on. See, I did a ketogenic diet, and it was fine. I felt fine. My
For 2
performance
months.
didn't suffer that much.
What was your blood markers?
They didn't really change a whole lot. Like I think I would consider them insignificant changes. I maintained.
What about your millimolars?
my millimolars?
Did you do urine ketones or blood ketones? or did you?
Oh, I
measure
didn't look at my
ketones?
blood. I didn't measure those. I
So
did
you
some
don't even
urine
know
sticks.
if you were really in. Oh, okay.
I did some urine sticks.
And what stage were you in, from moderate to high in terms of ketones?
I would have been the modified ketogenic diet, so I would have been not super, but I would have been.
So you barely
above
made it into
0.5.
ketosis.
Yeah.
I would have been above 0.5.
Dom, what do you
Yeah.
think? You barely made it
Well,
into
so
keto?
he's 8 weeks into it, and that's
Yeah.
about the point I was kind of feeling crummy and stuff. But so,
See, I actually
really
felt-
about 3. Well, not crummy, but cognitively it was
optimum.
kicking in. Yeah. But I was a little bit
Physical
flat in the
performance?
gym,
Yeah.
and then I started to fill out, and then it's a learning curve too, right?
But see, my thing was, if I can get the same benefits just by restricting my calories and keeping higher protein,
But do you
and
get
I love
the same
that flexibility.
benefits in terms
Yeah.
of cognitive function, in terms of
Okay, but
Dom,
that's-
science.
I would say, I mean, we study, you could look at PubMed, everything from polycystic ovary syndrome to acne, type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes now. That's a little bit controversial. Genetic metabolic migraines, a whole host of neurological disorders simply because beta hydroxybutyrate is, I believe, there's an objective truth that it's a superior metabolic fuel. And if
How
you
do you
have
define that?
millimolar levels in your blood, that's a significant amount of energy in your blood that your tissues can use.
How are you defining superior metabolic fuel? What's the objective measure?
The delta G of ATP hydrolysis in the heart is enhanced. So essentially, you're making more ATP for a given amount of oxygen.
Which actually means your metabolic rate could be slower.
Maybe you are more
Because you're dissipating
metabolically
less energy,
efficient. Yeah, so you're more metabolically efficient potentially, but I don't think in the context of fat loss. But it's also enhancing insulin sensitivity, and simply feeding ketones, independent of carbohydrate restriction, increases fat oxidation in the muscle.
So
this has been published.
There's been studies to look at like a ketogenic diet versus a non-ketogenic higher carb diet. And they show that basically by going ketogenic, you reduce overall insulin area under the curve by 20%. That was the number they got. Now, if I was type 1 diabetic, I would 100% do the ketogenic diet. 100%. Absolutely. Okay.
And
Now,
that's
this is not
very
medical.
controversial.
This is not medical. This is not medical advice. This is me personally.
So I actually, when I used to give talks, I would say for these things, but if you're type 1 diabetic, you want to avoid the ketogenic diet as much as possible because there's something called diabetic ketoacidosis.
But
But
that's-
like my student, Andrew Kutnick at USF.
That's if you've also got a lot of insulin.
Yeah, he has a blog on ketonutrition.org. Go to it, and it's a very detailed description about carbohydrate restriction and managing your blood glucose. And it goes really into the weeds if you want to read
So-
that.
So can I stop you there, though? Could you elaborate on that? So you used to say that if you were type 1 diabetic, you wouldn't...
I did because it was very controversial
But
territory.
now-
Describe what diabetic ketoacidosis is.
Yeah, so if you're type 1 diabetic, you make little or no insulin at all, right? And I guess maybe just going back to a normal person, when they fast or they do the ketogenic diet, it increases fat oxidation in the liver, and that fat oxidation actually accumulates acetyl-CoA, and that creates ketones, acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And it occurs in the context of insulin suppression. But you still have normal insulin, but it's very low, right? And then when your ketones get elevated, you spill some out in the urine, and that's how you eliminate them. Your muscles, your brain burns them. And if they get really high, you have a small increase in insulin release when your ketones get real high. And that insulin ramps down fat oxidation in the liver and decreases ketone production. So, and there's other things too, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds. But you're a normal person is finely tuned to maintain physiological ketones within a certain range with nutritional ketosis. With diabetic type 1 diabetes, that's completely thrown out the window. So without insulin being there, the absence of insulin essentially creates runaway ketogenesis, and your ketones become very, very high in the context of very high glucose.
Exactly.
So you have high glucose and high ketones. It creates a metabolic disruption. It creates an acidotic state and electrolyte imbalances and coma and death.
Which is
right?
not going to happen in people who are healthy who are just doing a ketogenic diet.
Right, but
So
what is
with
the...
type 1 diabetes, if you, for example, my student, using his as an example, because I think maybe he was using 20 or 30 IUs of insulin a day, right? And then starts carbohydrate restriction and even a modified ketogenic diet and can reduce that insulin requirement to 4, 5, 6 IUs a day. So literally knocking it down, to 20% of what he was taking.
So what has changed in
before.
your perception when you did not recommend it?
Well, there's a Harvard study that basically looked at a group called Type 1 Grit on Facebook. There's a group called Type 1 Grit, and it's got thousands of people who use a low carbohydrate approach, not necessarily a ketogenic diet approach. Some are, but it's very carbohydrate restricted in terms of what a doctor, an endocrinologist would prescribe for a type 1 diabetic. It would almost maybe look like suicide to some people. And low carbohydrate dramatically decreases your insulin requirements. And if you look at your continuous blood glucose, recordings over the course of a week, those numbers are much, much tighter. And that's going to pay huge dividends in the long run when it comes to longevity and health span. And, the potential for going blind or decreasing your kidney function, by these huge postprandial spikes. Essentially, if you're type 1 diet, you're always chasing your glucose with insulin injections, right? Or an insulin pump. If you're carbohydrate restricted, you're basically not, it's very liberating because your dependence on insulin is far, far less. Controversially, some people have gotten completely off of insulin. I would not recommend that, but some people are actually doing that.
So I think
highly not recommended.
I hear this from critics of the ketogenic diet, and this is a BS criticism. That again, here's me defending the ketogenic diet. Is that, well, you'll become people who are healthy. You have ketoacidosis. That is not going to happen because by definition, if your ketones are high and you're relatively healthy, not type 1 diabetic, your blood glucose is low. It's when both are elevated that it's dangerous. Okay, and if you're a type 1 diabetic like Andrew, who you're just using a little bit of insulin to get that baseline, to get your glucose levels down to a baseline level, and then you're using a carb-restricted diet that creates ketones while your blood glucose is at a normal basal level, that, again, not a doctor, not medical advice, that should not be dangerous, right?
And now, over the years, because he's a power lifter and he's a super big dude, he's like 250 pounds, like when he goes to the gym, he has learned that he can pulse a little bit of insulin and maybe ramp up his protein or maybe even take a little bit of carbohydrates. But, the next day, he's still doing low carb throughout the day. But he's learned to leverage, as a type 1 diabetic, you have that advantage, right? Because you can manipulate insulin for body composition alterations or things like that. So he has learned to adjust his protein to maximize his sort of gains and performance in the gym. And but nonetheless, he went from a strategy, he transitioned to a strategy that would look to be almost suicidal from the perspective of an endocrinologist doctor managing type 1 to do that level of carbohydrate restriction. Would be, and now we actually have hard science to show that can not only can be done, that dramatically decreases the variability of your blood glucose fluctuation throughout the day from a weekly perspective and your requirements for insulin. Whenever you could use less insulin to manage your blood glucose, that's a good thing. It's very hard for a doctor to argue against
in type 1 diabetics
using less insulin and keeping tighter numbers. There's no way to argue against that. So if you can follow the diet, so that this gets back to adherence again, right?
Again, so it's one of those things that, like you said, I'd like to see you try it and do it and whatnot. And you know what? I would probably be fine. But I enjoy having a variety of foods, and I enjoy having a variety of fuels as well.
No, I'm sure you do, but I'd still like to see you try it. Like those two are mutually exclusive.
No, you're right, but I
have a chapter in his book that's coming out that we worked, together, and just took some of the concepts that I've.
Don't you find that your preferences change as well, like in terms of your hunger pangs?
You don't crave sugary foods, carbohydrate foods anymore.
But you do. You like them. Yeah. Look at you.
I like them for.
Yeah, I like them.
He's getting hungry. He's got to leave.
Well, to get in the amount of, oh my God, give me the sugar.
Where's the pizza?
No, I don't.
What did you have for breakfast this morning?
What did I have for breakfast this morning? I had steak and eggs.
Whoa.
There you go.
And a
piece of
toast.
Keto. Oh.
And some toast. Oh, you son of a bitch with your bread.
God, stab him in the face.
What is wrong with you? God. Don't you know?
Spike my insulin.
I had a big serving of nothing. I
So,
feel lots of energy. Yeah.
But again, it's individual, and I want to to point out that if somebody likes a ketogenic, I've had people do a ketogenic diet. I've had people, get ready for shows on a ketogenic diet.
And why did you put them on a ketogenic diet?
Because that's what they liked. They had that preference for that. And it got to a point where for some people, their calories get so low if they have slow metabolic rates that the level of fat restriction it would take them to is probably not great for hormone levels. So I tended to pull a little bit more carb relative to fat. And so we didn't start out targeting them as ketogenic, but by the end they were. So you had to resort to something that actually works. Oh, stop it. Stop it. Basal because metabolic rate declines, you get to a point, especially to get that lean. I mean, I'm somebody who's more average muscle mass and pretty fast metabolism usually. I had to get down to under 2,000 calories a day to get ready for a show. So for me, I had my carbohydrates for briefly under 100 grams of carbs per day in that show prep.
I don't know if you remember, but I was sticking your fingers and measuring your glucose in the bathroom. I forget where.
My theory is that when you do that and you carb restrict and you calorie restrict rather and get down, once that shit's over, you just want to reward yourself as often as possible. So when someone comes along with something like a ketogenic diet and go, no bread, no pop, fuck you. You just don't want to do it.
You get, but you get the same, the adherence and the relapse is the same whether it's ketogenic or another diet.
Relapse,
like regaining weight.
Yeah, but
is it bread?
It's again
is
a discipline
your fixation,
issue.
like pasta and bread? Because
but is it?
There's no foods actually creates.
Yeah,
they've
got great stuff. Their waffles are excellent.
Bread. They have hamburger buns now. I think.
Yeah,
so
it's good stuff.
It is good.
I really like. I've made sandwiches with their stuff. What knocks me out more than anything of ketosis is just too much meat.
Yeah, gluconeogenesis.
Yeah, that's the one that gets me.
Again, I kind of go back to that the data is very mixed. Again, if we look at the overall data set, very mixed, and all diets have terrible adherence, right? But a lot of
that's discipline.
Yeah, but we also
that drives me crazy. I don't want to talk about people who aren't disciplined. I really have a giant hard problem with that because I know so many disciplined people, and I feel their momentum and vibration, and I'm like, I just want to concentrate on what they're doing because all these people that can't do it, I feel like that's contagious. You start thinking about people that can't adhere to diets and fall off. I get it for you because it's something that you do professionally.
But I'm gonna make it so for you the ketogenic diet clicks. And or eating more meat clicks. That's something that you really enjoy. You like the state.
Dude, I love pasta.
It makes discipline easier because it regulates your appetite.
But the data doesn't support
I think so too.
The data doesn't.
But the data doesn't support that it makes discipline easier in terms of your adherence or in terms of your long-term adherence.
Both. So, but hang on. Okay. For some people, this works better because they feel better. They have better adherence. For other people, if you say, now you've got some people, if you say, hey, you can have a cookie, it would screw them because they would just go crazy. But for other people, if you allow them more flexibility, their adherence improves. What I'm saying is we need to give people all the options on the table, not demonize any one diet and say, hey, maybe you try to figure out for lack of sounding what works for you and what you can sustain. Go from there.
But see, this is
I'm
the
totally
problem.
in agreement.
I am as well, but you keep saying can sustain. You definitely can sustain more than you do. The real problem is a giant percentage of the people are weak.
Oh, I would agree with that.
Like it's in the 40% people just quit, give up, don't do what they're supposed to do, don't do as many reps as they're supposed to do, don't work out, take days off just because they're lazy. And those are the people that get off the diet. It's a discipline issue more than anything.
The market for that is really big. So I think various foods that are emerging on the market right now, app-based systems, Virta Health actually has a great app-based system that actually coaches you through that. And I think that's very helpful. So I think new technologies, foods, and will increase adherence. Also, when you have a person who knows and understands all the health benefits associated with nutritional ketosis or just low carb, I think that can be a motivating factor to make them stick to the diet. So,
yeah, but for a guy like you who's rational and disciplined, but people that are self-destructive and weak, They're gonna, I can't do this anymore. I need a burger. I need fries. I need a shake.
Well, that's their choice.
But then kind of,
is.
what's the point of the whole conversation then, though?
Well, the point of the conversation is to avoid those motherfuckers because they're gonna drag you down to their mediocre level.
I think, but you just
dangerous people.
I think you need to sympathize with them a little bit because I think the market, and I think
so
this is a
sympathetic.
fruitful area for entrepreneurs to create technologies
right now.
and foods that can actually enhance adherence
Or
to
stop
eating
being a bitch.
strategies we know about. That too. So it's a combination.
I feel
of
like
things.
so much of it is what you're willing to accept from yourself. If you're willing to accept this seesaw obesity thing that so many people get on and off, this yo-yo effect, if you're willing to accept that, that's fine. But I just feel like it's a mental state. I really do. I see once you achieve a certain amount of success, people start sabotaging themselves. They start dwelling on the fact that they're doing well, but how long can they sustain this? It starts being a big fat mind fuck. And that's when you say, like, what's sustainable? What's sustainable? A lot more than you're willing to do. What's sustainable is stop being a bitch. Not you, the person out there that's listening.
I know.
To this. But you know what I mean? Yeah. It's like there's a thing, like we're giving people these fucking escape clauses. We're giving them these parachutes that they can pull. Don't pull the parachute, motherfucker. Just have a cheat day. That's fine. But don't get off your diet. Have a cheat meal. Eat a fucking giant sundae. Throw some syrup on that bitch. Get that whipped cream going. Do it once. But don't live your life like that. That's nonsense.
And I think that I wouldn't disagree with anything you said. I think
what people need to hear. Not this well, you can't sustain it. The ketogenic not sustain it. You sustain it.
They're not confident with their control. If you do intermittent fasting, if you fast for 3 days, that will give you a lot of confidence that you have control over food. Fasting for 3 days.
You can't say no diet is sustainable. It's not sustainable over. If you look at the general population and you get a bunch of weak bitches and you get them together, how many of them are going to keep it together? How many of them are going to run every day? How many of them are going to work out every day? Very, very, very few. You're dealing with outliers in particular just by virtue of what you do. How many people are willing to put the work in to achieve this?
Not many.
How many people are going to achieve this physique? Very, very few, right?
Thank you.
So we're talking about outliers. We're talking about that's what I like. I like outliers. I don't like people like, it's too hard. I can't hear that. I'm not. That's dangerous. I feel like that shit is worse than carbs.
That's why we talk a lot in the book about behaviors. Because if you change your behavior, that's what I think there's not enough research focused on is let's look at the people who actually achieve weight loss. And if you look at the people who achieve it and keep it off, they do it through many different methods, whether it's low carb, low fat, whatever it is. But let's look at the behaviors that they make. And those behaviors can tell us a lot about people. One thing we know is they practice they weigh themselves very often. So they're accountable. They practice some form of cognitive restraint, whether it's weighing food, recording macros, ketogenic, fat restriction, whatever it is. And also they exercise regularly. And there's physiological benefits to that. Exercise lowers the body fat set point that your body will defend. So it actually has a physiological benefit, but also just mentally, like you said. I mean, if you took me back 30 years ago and you told me, hey, or when I was 10 years old and you said, hey, when I was like bullied and picked on, had no self-esteem, you're going to fucking squat 668 pounds one day on your back at 201 pounds and set it's been broken since then, but a world record. I would have been like, there's no fucking way. There's no way. But when you have discipline, like you said, and that doesn't just, people say you should have more confidence. That's fucking horseshit advice. Confidence is built through you set a goal and you achieve it.
Yes.
And you set a goal and you achieve it. And you don't start out to say, I'm going to set a world record and that's your first goal.
Right.
I like what Will Smith said. He said, you lay a brick as perfectly as you can lay it. You do it again and you do it again and you do it again.
Yes.
And you talk to anybody who's successful in anything, they didn't start out saying, I'm going to do this earth-shattering thing.
Right.
They started out and built that confidence over years and years of achieving small goals, which then led them to their big goals.
Now we're on to something, because I think that the mental state in which you approach anything, a workout routine, a lifestyle, the way you decide to live your life, that is critical. And here's one of the things that people are cynical about that's probably one of the best sources of fuel is inspiration from other motivated people. Go to David Goggins' Instagram page every day. Watch that fucking savage. Watch what he
Met
does.
him.
And yeah, he's awesome. But go to people like him, Cameron Haynes. Go to people
Met him
like
too.
The Rock. Like these fucking people just do it. There's no escape. There's no I can't sustain. That's not. I don't want to hear that shit. That's nonsense.
And failing is good. It's okay if you
Yes.
fail. Like
Yeah,
if you
feel
don't
like shit,
fail,
and then
you're
you
not
feel
going to go
better
anywhere.
when you get back on the horse.
You're not pushing yourself hard
Yes.
enough if you're,
Well,
if you're
I
not
think
failing.
when I say sustainability, I mean if it's because everybody has stuff that they find. Again, you find a carb restricted diet to be easier to stick to for
It just
you.
feels better for me.
It feels better for you.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But if somebody is over here and says, you know what, I'm eating a low fat diet, I feel great, my blood markers are good, I have plenty of energy, what's wrong with that?
Nothing's wrong with that.
Exactly.
No, I mean,
There's my
biodiversity,
libertarian.
Unquestionably exists, right? There's a giant difference between all of this. Some people eat peanuts and they die, right? We all know that. There's just the body's just very, very different. They vary.
Exactly.
And the caloric requirements, the nutritional requirements. That's what's hard about this, right? Is finding this one thing that is best for you, and objectively, and being really analyzing your actual physical performance, which very few people do. They kind of say, well, I feel pretty good, but by what marker, right? Are you, what's your personal best? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you monitoring your heart rate? Are you monitoring your work output? Like, what are you doing to show that this diet is optimal for you?
Yeah. Well, and part of that is like, it's hard to get, that's a lot of money that's going to be spent to get that data, for an individual.
Sure.
So part of it is going to have to be, what do you feel good on? And what do you feel like is, again, most sustainable for you? Because no matter what, that people want a diet, what people really want is I don't want to have to track, and I don't want to have to sacrifice anything, and I want to get to my goal. Well, tough shit, that's not going to happen. You have to pick what you're going to sacrifice, right? So if you say, I hate tracking calories, so I'm just not going to eat carbs, because I can regulate my body weight that way, fuck yeah, do that. I had a post on Twitter that was like one of my most popular Twitter posts. I said, health improvements are largely driven by caloric restriction and weight loss. But if you like vegan, if you like keto, if you like carnivore, and I just listed a bunch of different diets, and they help you create a restriction and it keeps you at a healthy weight, then fuck yeah. Hell yeah. Like if somebody says, I like eating a vegan diet.
I'm not interested in losing weight, but ketogenic intermittent fasting is very, very easy for me. I love the food and I feel better. And I think all my health biomarkers are improving.
Can I
you
ask
don't
you
need,
this when
you don't need any other reasoning for why you should do it.
Right. Yeah. With him, it works. Now, can I ask you this? When you say diets aren't sustainable, the data doesn't show that. Were you talking about calorie-restricted diets, that overall weight loss diets? Or are you talking about dietary choices in terms of like ketogenic diet?
Excellent question. So it's that if you lose weight, we cannot keep it off. That is the big problem, is that most people are able to lose weight and they cannot keep it off because, one, the self-defense system that we talked about is
so
really
they lose weight too quickly. Their body gets into this state where it's always trying to regain that weight back.
Part of it, yeah, like losing it more quickly. There's debate about this, but I would say that you have to create a more extreme deficit to do that, and so you are activating your body's self-defense system more intensely, if I had to say it that way. So the rebound is usually bigger as well. So it's trying to find a way. Okay, can we get this weight off, and then let's really emphasize to people that the diet after the diet. Nobody talks about this, except for us in the book. Nobody talks about this. My co-writer for the book, Peter Baker, and I, we spent chapters talking about when you go and transition into, okay, we've lost the weight we want to lose, we're healthier, you have to have the same amount of discipline and intensity to then maintain that loss. Because if you let your foot off the gas, now you don't necessarily have to be at the same caloric restriction level. But if you just let yourself I'm going on vacation, I'm going to eat what I want. Boom, gain 10 pounds. And everybody knows people like this who they go and they do this.
Yeah.
And you've literally just undid months of hard work.
Right.
In 1 week.
Would you say if you could maintain that for a set amount of time, say 6 months? So I think that if someone can maintain that weight loss for 6 months, that's like sort of like the tipping point where they can go on.
Got my wheelhouse right here.
Go ahead.
So that's a great point. So leptin is I'm sure you've heard of people talk about leptin. So when you lose fat, leptin secretion goes down because fat cells secrete it. And it's kind of like your body's thermostat and body fat. Everybody has like a set point their body likes to be at. So if you lose body fat, you secrete less leptin, hunger goes up, metabolic rate goes down.
And ghrelin.
And ghrelin is in opposition to leptin. So this is your body like a thermostat. So if on a thermostat, if you set it at 75, goes too low, kick the heat on, bump it back up, goes too high, kick the cooling on, go back down. Leptin acts that way with your metabolic rate and your hunger. When you get down to a low body fat, leptin's low. Your body, you have a drive to regain that weight. Your hunger's higher, your metabolic rate is lower. Leptin still stays low even years after a diet in people who have kept the weight off. So you would think there'd still be a biological drive to regain the weight. That said, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, so any of my scientists who are listening on this, feel free to call me out on the carpet if you think I'm wrong. But just like obese people actually have high levels of leptin. They have high levels of leptin, but they become leptin resistant.
Leptin insensitive.
Right. If you stay at there is evidence that if you stay at a reduced body weight for 1 or 2 years, that can become your new set point that your body defends. I think what can happen is even if your leptin doesn't go up.
1 or 2 years, not 6 months.
Yeah, it's a little bit longer. Okay. It's a little bit longer.
So
but
what
it's a
is
good
the
start.
mechanism? What's happening over those 1 or 2 years?
Well, I think it's probably multifaceted because your body's so redundant. Usually nothing is ever one thing, typically.
Adjusting your set point.
I think one of the things that happens is probably your body becomes more sensitive to the leptin you have because you're leaner.
Now, I want to talk about performance because this is a big thing with athletes, and particularly in my field with fighters. Many of them are reluctant to try a ketogenic diet initially because of the first few weeks are pretty rough, and it really inhibits training, and you get that keto flu feeling, and I've experienced that too. But overall, is the ketogenic diet a good strategy for someone that's involved in some sort of a brutal athletic pursuit like football or wrestling?
It can be, absolutely, and it will be dependent upon being keto adapted over time and actually training in a state of ketosis. So you force those adaptations over time. We know the ketogenic diet is glycogen sparing over time. Glycolytic pathways will be decreased over time, so that may impair anaerobic power output initially, but I think that I think a good amount of people could adapt back to, especially if they're taking things like creatine monohydrate and taking various supplements that can kind of fill that gap to meet the glycolytic anaerobic energy demands.
You know Zach Bitter?
Yeah.
Zach Bitter, who holds the American record for the fastest 24-hour run, or the fastest 100-mile run. He did it in 11 hours and 40 minutes.
Insane.
Yeah, he ran 100 miles. It's fucking just nonsense.
I actually corresponded with him on Twitter one time. Not a zealot, by the way. Very smart guy.
Not a zealot at all. Very smart guy.
Jeff Bolick, I think, brought him to my attention, and actually we're looking at some of the muscle biopsies from various athletes that are doing similar things.
Yeah, he's on a ketogenic diet essentially, but when he does these long races, he takes in a considerable amount of glucose.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he uses those gels and take hundreds and hundreds.
Probably relatively sparingly compared to a person that's already very carb adapted. So you just want to, especially a 100-mile race, you titrate in small instead of drinking 50 or 100 grams of carbs. 20 grams of carbs every hour or two, maybe more than enough.
But say if you're
Zach,
burning
tweet
more
us if
fat.
You need to correct us.
Yeah. Well, Zach has a podcast that he also does with Sean Baker. And he basically eats mostly meat. I mean, Zach's diet consists of mostly ribeyes. So
he's fully keto and he's using glucose. I think glucose, and this may aggravate some of the keto people out. I think glucose is one of the most powerful performance-enhancing substances out there.
Really?
And I'll go on the record
glucose gel?
for that, especially in the context of that, where your glycogen levels are being depleted over time. And even from a training perspective, very small amounts of glucose are anti-catabolic, maybe argue anabolic, in the context of certain scenarios. So
Floyd Mayweather drinks a Coca-Cola
but
or
small
a Pepsi
amounts.
right after he trains.
Well,
Is there any benefit to that?
well, I mean, you're going to get glycogen replenishment.
Right. But like,
And actually, there's research out of Layman's lab years ago that showed that actually sucrose replenishes glycogen in muscle faster than pure glucose, which is interesting. Probably because the fructose gets taken up by the liver, so the glucose you do eat, the liver doesn't steal any of it, and it goes your glucose going to muscle. But
I would
You
say
know, it's just
ketones too. So the science is very
Exogenous.
new, but exogenous ketones, especially in the context of aerobic performance.
do you mean like ketogenics or like a ketone ester?
Ketogenics products is great. Ketone esters, most of the science behind ketone esters, but there are valid applications for the ketone salts that are emerging on the market too, like ketogenics. I think that the science just over the last couple of years has been incredible emerging on that. And I think it's something to watch over time. It's a new fuel source. It's like the fourth macronutrient, right? We have carbs, proteins,
No, that's alcohol.
and fats and alcohol. Yeah, arguably it can be. So I view ketones as they are a calorie containing energy source. So they are a fourth macronutrient.
Now, let me ask you this. If you were doing nutritional consultant for, say, someone who's a UFC champion, and they said, I want to get on the optimal diet for performance, you don't think that a ketogenic diet is the optimal diet for performance. Is that safe to say? Or you would have to experiment with them for a long period of time?
I think, one, it's going to be individual.
You
Like,
certainly wouldn't do it in the midst of a camp, right? If someone had
no.
a
So
2-month camp.
Oh man, that's such a nuanced
it's an
question.
off-season thing.
It's such a nuanced question, but the problem is you don't necessarily get an off season because if they call you with a fight, it's
Right.
not
Yeah.
looked nicely upon if you turn it down.
Right.
So, I think based on the research I've seen, I think you're hard pressed to convince me that a ketogenic diet is worse than a non-ketogenic diet on endurance. I think that's pretty clear, and there may actually be some benefits depending on the individual. As far as repeated sprints or things where you need that anaerobic system, I am not ready to say that a ketogenic diet is going to be as good. I think that a non-ketogenic diet offers you... Now, this is where ketone supplements may be actually the best thing possible, because you could be using glucose, so you're getting that fuel source, and taking a ketone supplement where you're getting that fuel as well.
So not on a ketogenic diet, but taking ketone supplements.
Again, I
Yeah.
don't. I think
Ben
the more
Greenfeld-
I want to
fuels, the
see. I
better.
want to see more research. I want to see more research.
Fats, carbohydrates, maybe amino acids, creatine. I mean, just basically trying to leverage all the various substrates that your body can use, especially if we're talking about anaerobic.
Now people are going to call me a
power
ketogenic
output.
supplement show.
You want to have a suite of different fuel sources, and not rely the term metabolic flexibility, which is kind of used quite often. But I think if you train and get your body fat and keto adapted, that provides benefits for recovery. It provides benefits if you're getting
What are the benefits for recovery?
enhanced, lower inflammation, lower chronic inflammation over time. Chronic inflammation can contribute to insulin resistance, poor neuroinflammation. If you're getting concussions or even subconcussive events over time, can actually cause a lot of damage. And I think
what is the mechanism that decreases inflammation with the ketogenic diet as opposed to a non?
A number of mechanisms. I mean, just simply lowering insulin spikes and glucose, but the NLRP3 inflammasome is something that we looked at. There was a study where actually we used the ketone ester, and it was published in the journal Nature Medicine, showing that in response to LPS, which is kind of like a very powerful inflammatory stimulant, that it reduces that and suppresses inflammatory pathways for a particular pathway.
Compared to?
You mean?
So, when you're in study, you're always comparing two things.
Yeah.
So what was the control group?
The control group for the inflammation, or it was just compared to control.
Compared to
yeah.
So you give
nothing. So it's just like
did you give a placebo? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So in the context of being in a state of ketosis, it reduces an inflammatory pathway. Think of it as a hub, and when that's activated, you have a host of inflammatory cytokines that flow throughout your body and your brain and cause this persistent low-grade neuroinflammation, inflammation in the body that can impede recovery processes over time. And I think that really contributes to brain health too. So I might be getting a little far ahead of myself because it's animal work, but it's convincing animal work looking at a particular pathway that's pretty well defined.
And before you get to this, is there a variation between low carb versus ketosis?
An elevation of ketone levels in your blood.
Right, but I mean in terms of, is there a benefit to the ketogenic, to being in a state of ketosis with this reduction of inflammation versus low carb?
I believe there is, just by elevating the metabolite beta-hydroxybutyrate, but I do think even low carb has some anti-inflammatory effects.
But optimal would be ketosis.
Like I said, I don't think it's going to be optimal for everybody, but I know there's going to be benefits to maintaining low to moderate levels of ketones for neurological health and also for recovery and maybe performance.
Layne, you were wincing at the mention of inflammation.
More so so we mentioned recovery from exercise, inflammation.
And calorie deficit is a very powerful
anti-inflammatory.
So, I mean, Layne addresses that.
Thank you for the context, my fellow scientist, non-zealot. Appreciate that. So one thing I want to, because people it's easy to get into black and white thinking. We hear inflammation and we think, oh, that's bad. That's bad. So there's some studies that tell us quite a bit about inflammation. Your body actually has an optimal level of inflammation. Too little inflammation is actually bad as well. So if you look
versus chronic, I was talking about chronic.
Yes, this is a lot of scientists miss too. Is acute. We can talk about mTOR and cancer and people acute versus chronic, and how scientists even mess this stuff up. But if you look at studies of recovery from exercise and muscle growth, I'm focusing on this, but I'll bring it back around. If you give ibuprofen to healthy people who have normal levels of inflammation, ibuprofen inhibits muscle growth. If you give it to elderly people with high levels of inflammation, they grow more muscle. So this means that the body, for recovery, has an optimal level of inflammation it likes to be in. There is a kind of a curve here.
It's a COX-2 inhibitor, and beta-hydroxybutyrate is also a COX-2 inhibitor.
Right. And so the part of growing muscle and recovery is actually inflammation. Macrophages and all these sorts of things are involved in that process. Now, if it gets run away, if it's too much, it's not a good thing. But if it's too little, it's also not a good thing. Andy Galpin did a great job on your show of talking about recovery versus adaptation, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things he said, if you do ice baths, you do these sorts of things, you're in the short term allowing yourself to recover faster, but you're also limiting how much adaptation you're going to incur. And I loved that because people miss this. They say, if you're somebody in the off season, if you're trying to get more lean body mass or trying to get better at something, it's probably good to let your body, for lack of a better term, have some inflammation, and not in the long term, but in response to that training session. But then if you're in a camp, again, this is where it's context dependent, right. Or I'm a powerlifter getting ready for a meet and I'm supposed to be squatting 4 times a week. I've done that before. And I'm so sore that I can't squat my 4th session. Then an ice bath or something. I'm not worried about growing muscle in that time. I'm worried about getting recovered enough that I can go do my next training session, because that is a lot more important for my competition coming up than having that little bit of extra muscle.
So in camp, probably a good idea. Post-season, not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, unless, again, it's all contextual dependent, right? Like if you start getting so sore that you can only train twice a week, then maybe a certain level. But that points back to that there's an optimal range of inflammation that your body probably should be in that's optimal for health as well. Now, I don't think doing a ketogenic diet for somebody, it's going to take them out of that necessarily. But I always want to give context, because people hear these things and they always think it's as a positive, in terms of recovery.
I believe that it can enhance the adaptive process associated with recovery. And I also believe that being in a ketogenic state will enhance your readiness, your resilience, and your recovery. So from a military perspective too, I believe that. And that needs to be validated and studied, but it's something that we study.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but when you advise this to the military, do they do you put them on a specific meal plan too, or do they have
it's more like
consultants that know how to do that?
Grants where this is being studied at a very fundamental, very controlled level, from cells to animal models to human clinical trials going on, and where the data is being collected now. And some of it is taken empirically and anecdotally from the field, or just from various exclusive channels, I guess I would say. So that I am coming at it as a biased, and I'm kind of speaking ahead of the science. But I do think that science already exists showing that you have a greater adaptive effect just by virtue of lowering inflammation over time in athletes, especially. This probably pertains more to endurance athletes. So it really needs to be studied in resistance and MMA fighters and things like that.
So there was a recent study, and I can't remember the researcher's name. I'll send it to you. I had a lot of criticisms of it, but they did show that ketogenic versus non-ketogenic diet in people who were lifting weights, trying to get bigger, that there was actually slightly less muscle mass using the ketogenic diet.
Well, you think that would be because of the less protein?
No, they equated protein, I'm pretty sure. I want to say they equated protein. Now, I don't know for sure, so I don't want to say authoritatively, but I believe that.
But to stay in ketosis, you're going to have...
And calories. Did they adjust for calories?
I believe they did. Okay. So, again, I could be wrong, and so I'll go back and look, and I'll send it to you if you want it. But it is possible, like, again, for every give me, there's a gotcha in certain things, right? So, like, these things that activate different pathways, well... Part of what ketones may signal is a deficit, because usually you don't have them in a surplus, right? So, we don't know if you can, like, for example, like autophagy, right? Like if we're talking about performance and muscle, everybody hears autophagy, and that's by the way, that's such a weird way to pronounce that because it's auto and phagocytosis, so it shouldn't be autophagy, but anyway.
It's a very rapidly emerging science, and Naomi Whittel wrote a book about this, and it's like a New York Times bestseller. And that really covers the science. So the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, lysosomal remodeling and degradation of proteins.
Yes.
But
very hot topic right now.
What gets me is like people who are big on intermittent fasting. They'll say, "Oh, it increases autophagy," but they're also saying you can grow all this muscle and it's going to be best for building muscle. But that's not true, because autophagy is part of protein degradation. So if you're increasing that system, by definition, that's less muscle. So there's always a give me and a gotcha. For one benefit, there might be a drawback. Now, depending on your individual situation, maybe it makes more sense, right? Like having the most muscle mass possible may not be the best thing for health. Now, we know that having more muscle mass than normal is good for health, but maybe having like absolute peak muscle mass may not be the best thing for health. Yeah. So it's like, that's why I was trying to say earlier, there's never going to be one diet that just fixes all of our problems. It depends on the individual and what they're trying to get out of it. Just like if I went to, and again, I watched MMA for years, loved your commentary. That's where I learned a lot of stuff about MMA. But if I went to a Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor and I said, what's the best technique? He's going to look at me like I'm an idiot, right? Because he's not just going to say, armbar every time. That's the best technique for jiu-jitsu. And that's when people say, what's the best diet? It's the same thing, right? It's completely contextual dependent, right? Depends on you, and in the case of MMA, depends on your opponent as well.
What your goals are and your strategies and your tactics.
I think what we were trying to really emphasize is that individuality dependent, but also what I really wanted to emphasize in today's show was calories matter. Calories matter. Even if you're eating low carb, you can't just eat as much as you want.
And low carb is a very viable option. Yes. To induce and sustain a calorie deficit that can contribute to body composition.
But even like you brought up Floyd Mayweather earlier, which I thought was great because you said he drinks a Coke after training. Well, it's hard to argue with his results, but then again, sometimes elite athletes can get away with a lot of really dumb shit because they're so genetically superior that they were going to do well no matter what.
Didn't Michael Jordan eat a Big Mac before every game?
Huh.
No, not true?
Steak and baked potato.
Steak and baked potato?
Yeah.
Where's the Big Mac myth come from?
He was sponsored by McDonald's.
Motherfuckers. Steak and baked potatoes sounds like a
My
good
wife
meal.
can eat 2 or 3 Big Macs in a sitting and wash it down with a full sugar Coke and still gain nothing. Yeah. I know. I cringe, but some people can do that.
This is on Floyd's
but
personal chef.
But it's did he become this great because he ate this way, or can he eat this way because he's this great athlete? It's probably the latter, right? So we wouldn't recommend like if somebody's sitting at home and they want to become the greatest boxer ever, don't go, probably drinking Coke isn't the first step, right?
Right.
But this is what we do with nutrition, because we pick out people that we follow and we go, oh, I'm just going to do that. And it's so individual
It's on
dependent.
the sidelines of marathons. Like they'll hand off Cokes to people.
Is that
in
because Coke
marathon
sponsors
stuff.
it,
I've
or
seen it.
because people just want it for fuel?
People just want it for fuel.
Tastes
Is
good.
it
along
not
with
a
the Gator.
bad idea when you're doing something that's as grueling as a marathon?
See, I don't want to say it's a bad idea.
I don't. Yeah, I'm not against it either. If you're a
'Cause
carb
it's so
burner, it makes sense. Yeah.
dense, right?
Yeah, but you want calorie-dense
Yeah,
stuff when you're
that's
when
what
you're
I'm
there.
saying.
Absolutely.
It wouldn't be a
So,
bad thing.
Again, context is so important because we say, well, don't ever drink a Coke. Well, if you were starving to death, I promise you'd drink a Coke.
Right.
So it's and if you need quick energy, it's probably not the worst thing that Floyd Mayweather could possibly do post-training.
Sufficient, but
right?
not optimal.
Yeah,
A lot of people eat those honey waffles, like when they're doing hikes and stuff.
But again, at the end of the day, if his carbohydrate intake, and I don't know what it is, but if he's eating 500-600 grams of carbohydrate a day, is it really hurting him to have 40 grams of sugar from a Coke? If he's like maintaining his body weight, performing optimally,
Probably especially when you think about the kind of grueling workouts that guy puts his body
and maybe
through.
maybe that's the
Pop-Tarts.
only way he can. Maybe I don't know. Again, I am theorizing. Maybe that's the only way he can get enough food in is to eat really energy dense sources of food to maintain his body weight. And if you started saying, well, we need you to eat chicken breast and broccoli and this organic rice and all this he might start dropping weight like a stone and his performance go in the tank. So this is why context is so important. And again, like when we talk about, people think, how many times have you seen two guys in the octagon and just looked at their bodies and gone, this one guy's going to smash this other guy, like just in the primal part of your brain because he was built like a tank. And then the other guy who looks like nothing just goes out and completely obliterates him.
Happens all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. Right? So it's completely context dependent. The biggest thing is to make sure that you don't run out of fuel during these things, right? Or whatever your sport is. I mean, again, I'm known as a carb guy, and I had this powerlifter one time telling me, he's like, don't you think you should carb load the night before a powerlifting meet? I was like, dude, you're doing 9 reps. Like you're doing, so you get 3 attempts on each lift, squat, bench press, and deadlift. You're not depleting
You're
glycogen.
not carb limited. So
You're not like, he's
that's
like,
what really amazed me. Even like you can fast for a week, which I did in deadlift, and it's not a significant inhibitor of your performance.
Whereas like running would be.
oh yeah.
Running hills or something like that.
Or doing,
Rowing.
prolonged,
Yeah.
resistance training,
Right.
3 hours, something like
But
that.
even then, it's probably not optimal to go in fasted to
Yeah,
go do a
right.
strength, an
Absolutely
athletic
not.
event. But it's you have to pick the context, the individual, and honestly, people probably aren't going to want to hear this from a scientist, but we don't know enough about this stuff yet to really say for each individual person what's best for them, and that's why we kind of got to go by feel.
We know
Yeah.
you don't have to go drinking Gatorade throughout your 1 hour workouts
No.
in the gym. Typically,
Yeah.
I'm drinking ketones, but it's not going to offer you
It's
any
Gatorade, it's
advantage.
fine.
It's not, and I did that for many years actually, and I think guys still do it now.
Of
I mean,
course.
we see it all the time.
But I mean,
you got to make your shake in the gym and drink it intra-workout.
One of the things that drove me nuts was I kind of got in a little bit back and forth with Tim Noakes on Twitter, and he kind of made it out to seem that people were dismissing some of his research because people in academia or that peer review is broken.
Who's Tim Noakes?
Oh, sorry, he's a big low carb proponent. He's a professor in South Africa, I want to say.
Yeah.
And
Very
he's-
knowledgeable,
and-
opinionated, but very knowledgeable.
He said to me, he's like, well, that's because you've never challenged convention. Because I was, and Dom knows, I have challenged every convention in the fitness industry that there ever was. But it's just, when people ask me,
He's
this
vocal
kind of
about
stuff,
it,
yeah,
and assertive, but
I
you're
just
also
don't-
open-minded.
Yeah, I'm very open-minded.
Yeah.
I just don't if you can't show me a hard evidence, there was a great quote from Thomas Sowell that I saw the other day. It said, you could ask these in science and go a long way in terms of sorting out bullshit. Compared to what? Where's your hard evidence? And what is the cost? Right? So it's, well, low carb is better compared to what? And what's the cost on performance or any of these other things? And then where's your hard evidence, right? So this is why, like I said, science over time, yes, you can have industry influences, you can have muddled data, and some scientists fake data. We've both come across this, scientists who have fake data.
How frustrating is that?
Oh, it makes me so incensed. In fact, I won't say anybody by name, but I used to be in business with somebody who I found out that I had no hard evidence, but I had a lot of circumstantial evidence that they were faking data. And
this even happens in cancer research. It's a huge problem, even in cancer research.
And I took this person out to dinner, and I told them, I was like, we're done. Like, this thing we're doing is done. And thank goodness I did, because it came out later. People started trying to replicate his data, and nobody could replicate his data. And they still had a pretty big following even now, but it's one of those things that it makes me so mad, because then people get so frustrated because they feel like, if they feel like scientists are just in industry's pocket, why are they going to believe anything any of us say? It's so frustrating, and that's why.
What's the motivation?
Money, power, ego.
If a lab's, it's a company's funding you for a particular supplement, and you come out consistently with negative data, what's the incentive for them to keep funding you?
But if you're always showing positive results on supplement studies, supplements companies will want to fund you, of course. Now,
of course.
But it's so.
It just seems like it's so dangerous.
But I also want people to keep in mind that
it's got to be done in a very controlled, blinded fashion. That's the only way around it.
I keep reminding people, like people who say things like, "We found the cure for cancer, and the government is suppressing it," and all the scientists are just in the. What you're saying is that every scientist on the planet who does cancer research is an immoral, unethical piece of shit. That's what you're saying, because you're telling me they don't have friends and family who are dealing with cancer, and they're suppressing this research. Come on now.
Yeah.
And that's the other big. I'm a small government guy, and I'm like I said, a libertarian. But one of the things that makes me cringe about libertarians sometimes is these big, elaborate conspiracy theories that come up around science and whatnot. Like, you realize, like, a senator can't even text a dick pic to his side chick without, like, it winding up all over Twitter. You think they constructed these big, elaborate theories? They can't even tie their shoes in the morning without spending $10,000, So the idea that, like, all this research is being suppressed by the government, I'm not saying it's never happened, but I think it's pretty darn rare.
Well, gentlemen, we just did 3+ hours.
Thank you.
Really,
How
it
crazy is
felt
that?
like 6. No, I'm just kidding.
It flew by.
Appreciate you giving us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
About that.
Thanks for illuminating this stuff, which is still, it's so complex. It's part of the problem. And I think we could do 100 of these shows, and we'd never cover all the topics or all the issues or all the details. And I think it's so incredibly difficult for people to find the right diet and program that works for them.
I'd like to add one thing, that the science is rapidly emerging, and the Metabolic Health Summit, which is happening in the end of January, beginning of February, next year, 2019, will be bringing in the leading scientists that are talking about all the different topics right now, including weight loss. And that's going to be in LA. It's actually, there's a flyer in your book there. If you look inside there, giving you a flyer.
All right. LA, January 31st to February 3rd in Long Beach.
MetabolicHealthSummit.com. It's going to be a very comprehensive group of basic scientists, clinical scientists, entrepreneurs, and people, everyday people that are just interested in this space.
You going to this?
And I will be at it. I'm helping to sort of organize and promote it, but also moderating some of the things. We're going to hit on basically every topic that was discussed in my last podcast and this podcast, the leading scientists.
I'm going to show up and heckle.
Yeah, so we definitely want Layne there too, and I think it would be great to have a panel discussion that addresses this with a couple more experts and personalities in that. I think
it's
awesome.
amazing how much information you have to absorb. It's really. I've done so many diet podcasts, and I'm still a moron.
Well, that's why, like, I always say people, it's hard, because if you're not going to do a degree yourself or do research yourself, it's so hard to know who. Like, you kind of have to pick people that you trust.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so hard to know who to trust, because there was something that Greg Nuckols, really smart guy, said that I think kind of ties things together nicely. He said, people are really good at knowing when somebody has more knowledge than them about a subject. Like you talk to somebody for a little bit and you really can get an impression pretty quickly if they know more or less than you or about the same. What they're really bad at doing is figuring out amongst two people who know more than them, who is the more knowledgeable of the two. They are very bad at picking that out. So you kind of got to pick people who you trust. Now, if you're looking for people to trust, notice the 3 magic words that me and him both said on here today at one point. I don't know. Usually, experts, they don't make broad claims. They don't use superlatives. They don't say things like best, worst, never, always. They're usually putting context to everything, and they're providing you with information that helps illuminate you that everything is nuanced. And that's why, like, I'm sure, again, I'll relate it to MMA. If you talk to anybody who's an expert in any different discipline and you ask them a broad question, you're going to get a really broad answer. And if you ask them a specific question, give them a lot of context, then they'll give you a specific answer. Would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely.
So
And
I think
if someone's really strong on one side, dig kind of deep and look for conflicts of interest too. And so I think that's kind of an important thing. I try to be transparent as much as possible on sort of things we're involved in. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, and I'm not without bias too. Yeah. I mean, I sell stuff. I've got a book out. I've got another book coming out. I have a website. So it's...
Yeah, but you're not actually, you're not
BioLayne.com.
advocating any particular approach. You're kind of approaching it from...
Right, what I'm selling isn't really sexy.
The complete contest prep guide, and this is available on
BioLayne,
Amazon, all those places.
BioLayne.com.
BioLayne.com,
yep.
And your Twitter, BioLayne,
Instagram,
BioLayne,
yep.
And Dom.
Yeah, ketonutrition.org, and Ketone Technologies is our company. It's an information website. I don't have any products per se, at least not yet, but I put products on there that I personally use and kind of vetted out that I think could be helpful, and just a lot of information. Like your prior podcast with me is on there.
Awesome.
And Tim Ferriss and
cool.
Rhonda Patrick too. So
Great.
I have right on the front page. So.
Your Twitter and Instagram?
Yeah, Dominic.D'Agostino.kt, I think, is Instagram. I'm not a huge Instagram guy, but D'Agostino, DAGOSTI 2 is my Twitter handle. And Dominic D'Agostino for Facebook, too. So there are 3
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we got a lot accomplished today.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate
it.
it.
Thanks, Joe.